In Greek mythology, the gods ruled from their palaces on Mount Olympus, but the world below belonged to a new breed of men and women. They were the heroes, mortals of extraordinary courage and strength who carried divine blood in their veins. They slew monsters that terrorized entire kingdoms, solved riddles that no other mind could unravel, and sailed to the edges of the known world in search of glory. But the gods who gave them their gifts also demanded a price, and for every triumph there was a tragedy waiting. But what crime did Heracles, the strongest man who ever lived, commit to deserve his infamous 12 labors? How did Oedipus, the man who solved the Sphinx's impossible riddle, become the most tragic figure in all of Greece? And how did a wooden horse bring down the mighty walls of Troy and end 10 years of war? Who was the Cyclops whose curse doomed Odysseus to wander the seas? And how did he survive the sirens whose sweet songs no man had heard and lived to tell? I'm David Rintoul. This is Deep Dive History, the podcast where we explore the myths, the empires, and the people that have shaped our world. And you're listening to Heroes, the greatest tales from Greek mythology. Part 1. Cadmus, the founder of Thebes. Cadmus was the brother of Europa, the princess who had been abducted by Zeus in the form of a white bull. When Europa disappeared, Cadmus had set out to find her, searching across the known world for any trace of his sister. For months he wandered, following every rumor and chasing every lead, but Europa had been taken by the king of the gods himself, and no mortal's search could ever find her. Desperate for answers, Cadmus travelled to Delphi. The oracle told him his sister was lost forever, but that the gods had other plans for him. He was to follow a sacred cow he would find outside the temple, and where it came to rest, he must found a city. Cadmus followed the creature for days across the hills of central Greece, until it lay down in a fertile valley surrounded by mountains. This was where his city would stand. To sanctify the site, Cadmus needed water from a nearby spring to perform the proper sacrifice. He sent his companions to fetch it whilst he prepared the ceremony. But when the men did not return, Cadmus set out to the spring himself to see what had happened, only to find a scene of horror. The bodies of his companions lay scattered across the rocks, blood and limbs everywhere, and at their centre was a creature unlike any he had seen before. It was a dragon, covered in rows of bronze scales that marked it as sacred to the god of war. Cadmus took up his spear and charged. The dragon lunged, fangs bared, but Cadmus was quicker. He drove the spear deep into the creature's throat, and the dragon thrashed and shrieked as its life poured out onto the stones. As Cadmus stood over the corpse, Athena herself appeared before him. "You have done well," the goddess said, "but this creature was sacred to Ares. You must make amends." She instructed him to take the dragon's teeth and plant them in the earth like seeds. Cadmus did as commanded, pulling the massive fangs from the dragon's skull and pressing them into the soil. Immediately the ground began to churn. Armoured warriors sprouted from where each tooth had been planted, rising fully grown and armed, their eyes empty and their faces set for war. They were the Spartoi, the sown men, and they turned toward Cadmus with weapons raised. But then Athena whispered to him, "Throw a stone among them." Cadmus picked up a rock and hurled it into their midst. The stone struck one warrior's helmet with a clang. Immediately he turned and attacked the man beside him, accusing him of the blow. The second warrior struck back, and within moments all the Spartoi were fighting each other in a chaotic melee. They hacked and stabbed until only 5 remained standing, exhausted and bloody, but finally calm. These 5 survivors became the first citizens of Thebes, the founding families of the city Cadmus would build on that spot. But killing Ares' sacred dragon came with a price. The god of war forced Cadmus to serve him as a slave for 8 long years before his crime could be forgiven. When his service finally ended, Ares was so impressed by Cadmus's loyalty and endurance that he offered him a great honor, the hand of his daughter, Harmonia, in marriage. Harmonia was the child of Ares and Aphrodite, born from the secret affair they had continued over the years. The wedding was a grand celebration, with all the gods of Olympus descending to Thebes to witness the union. But one god arrived with darker intentions. Hephaestus, Aphrodite's husband, had only recently discovered his wife's betrayal and the existence of her illegitimate daughter. At the wedding feast, he presented Harmonia with a gift, an exquisite necklace of gold and jewels crafted with a perfection only Hephaestus could achieve. Harmonia accepted it with joy, never suspecting that the smith god had woven a terrible curse into every link of the chain. The necklace would bring misfortune and tragedy to anyone who possessed it, and it would be passed down through Harmonia's family for generations. Unaware of the curse, Cadmus and Harmonia ruled Thebes in peace for many years. They had 5 children together, 4 daughters and 1 son, and the city prospered under their reign. But eventually, the curse of Harmonia's necklace began its terrible work. One by one, tragedy claimed their children. Their first daughter was Semele, the woman who bore Dionysus to Zeus but died when she saw the god's true form. Another daughter, Agave, became the mother to Pentheus, the prideful king who would make the fatal mistake of banning Dionysus's worship in the city, leading to the god's worshippers tearing him apart with their bare hands. A third daughter, Ino, married a man who went mad and murdered her children, while a fourth, Autonoe, was the mother of Actaeon, the hunter who was transformed into a stag by Artemis and torn apart by his own hunting dogs. The curse passed from generation to generation, each suffering without ever knowing why. Yet of all Cadmus's descendants, of all those who wore that cursed necklace and sat upon Thebes' throne, none would endure a fate more terrible than the 7th king. His name was Oedipus, and his story would become the most famous tragedy in all of Greece. Part 2. Oedipus. Laius, the 6th king of Thebes and a descendant of Cadmus, had everything a man could want: a prosperous city, a beloved wife, and the promise of an heir to one day succeed him. But like so many who came before him, he made the mistake of consulting the oracle at Delphi about his future. The priestess's words were unambiguous and terrible. "Your son will kill you and bring ruin to your house." Laius returned to Thebes with dread in his heart. When his wife Jocasta gave birth to a son, he looked at the infant and saw not a child but a future murderer. He could not bring himself to kill the baby directly, for that would be a crime against the gods, but he could ensure the child did not survive. He summoned a trusted shepherd and gave him orders. "Take the infant to Mount Cithaeron, far from the city, and leave him there to die of exposure. To make certain the child could never crawl to safety, Laius pierced the baby's ankles with a pin, binding them together. The shepherd took the crying infant, its feet already beginning to swell from the wound, and set out for the mountain. But when the shepherd reached the desolate slopes of Cytheron and looked down at the helpless child, he found himself unable to carry out his orders. Instead, he waited until he encountered a shepherd from the nearby city of Corinth and gave him the child instead. "Take this baby far from here," the Theban shepherd said. "See that he is cared for, but never let him know where he came from." The Corinthian shepherd agreed and brought the infant to his own king and queen, Polybus and Merope, who had long desired a child without any success. They welcomed the baby with joy, and when they saw his swollen, damaged feet, they named him Oedipus, meaning swollen foot, a name that would forever mark him as one who had known suffering from his very first breath. Oedipus grew up in Corinth, believing himself to be the legitimate son of Polybus and Merope. He was strong, intelligent, and quick to anger, traits that would bring him both joy and hardship in the years to come. For a time he lived a good life with his adoptive parents, but all it would take would be a single comment for it to all come crashing down. Attending a feast one evening, young Oedipus would be confronted by a drunk who shouted an accusation for all to hear. "Bastard child! You're no true son of Polybus. Everyone in Corinth knows it but you." The man was quickly dragged away, but the words lodged in Oedipus's mind like a splinter. He asked his parents if he was truly their son, and they assured him he was. But doubt had taken root. When he was unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Oedipus travelled to Delphi to consult the oracle himself. He stood before the priestess in the temple, the air thick with incense, her eyes distant, lost in whatever visions the gods sent her. "Tell me," Oedipus demanded, "who are my true parents?" But the oracle did not answer his question. Instead, she delivered a prophecy that would haunt him forever. "You will kill your father and marry your mother. You will bring ruin and pollution to your family and your city." Oedipus staggered from the temple, unable to shake the words from his mind. He thought of kind King Polybus and gentle Queen Merope, the only parents he had ever known. He loved them both so dearly, and could not bear to imagine the events of the prophecy being played out against them. He made his decision immediately. He would never return to Corinth. If he stayed away from his parents, the prophecy could never be fulfilled. He would go somewhere else, anywhere else, and build a new life far from those he loved. He set out on foot, not knowing where he would go, knowing only that he could never go home. But fate would not let him escape so easily. The road he took led him east, towards Thebes, the true city of his birth, although he did not know it. The road narrowed as it approached a crossroads, a place where three paths met in a rocky junction. Oedipus was walking when he heard the rattle of wheels behind him. A chariot was approaching, and approaching fast, with no intention of slowing. The driver was shouting curses at him, demanding he move aside to clear a path for his betters. Oedipus stepped to the side, but not quickly enough. The chariot thundered past, and, as it did, the passenger, an elderly man with a grey beard and a cruel face, struck Oedipus across the head with his staff, berating him for daring to be in the way. Oedipus's mind clouded with rage. He had committed no offence, he had moved aside, and this arrogant old man had struck him like a disobedient slave. He lunged forward, grabbing the staff and pulling the old man from the chariot. They fought there in the dust of the crossroads, the old man and his guards against Oedipus alone, but Oedipus was strong and well-trained, with him killing them all in his fury, the guards, the driver, and finally the old man himself, beating him to death with the very staff he had used to strike. When it was over, Oedipus stood among the bodies, his hands bloody, his rage giving way to the cold realization of what he had done. He had killed in self-defense, he reassured himself. The old man had struck first. Any man would have done the same in his place. He dragged the bodies to the side of the road and continued on his way, not knowing that the elderly man lying dead in the dust was Laius, the king of Thebes, his true father. The first part of the prophecy had been fulfilled. Oedipus continued along the road until the walls of Thebes came into view, but as he approached the city gates, he saw something that made him stop. The gates were closed and the walls lined with guards, and at the main entrance, perched on a rocky outcrop, was a creature unlike anything he had ever seen. It had the head of a woman, beautiful in a cold and fearsome way, with eyes that held no mercy. Its body was that of a lion, while its back sprouted the wings of a great bird. This was the Sphinx, sent by Hera to punish Thebes for the crimes of its kings. The creature had been terrorizing the city for months, stopping anyone who tried to enter or leave, and asking a riddle. Those who answered incorrectly were torn apart on the spot, with the roads to Thebes now lined with bloody corpses. With no way to pass the beast, trade had all but stopped, with the city slowly succumbing to starvation. The situation had become so desperate that the rulers of Thebes had made a proclamation. Anyone who could destroy the Sphinx would be made king and would marry Queen Jocasta, recently widowed after her husband disappeared on the road to Delphi. As Oedipus approached the gates, the Sphinx turned its unsettling gaze towards him, a vicious smile appearing on its lips. "Another traveller," it purred, its voice unnatural, like a beast mimicking human speech without truly understanding it. "Do you know the price of entry?" "I know," Oedipus said, fighting to keep the fear out of his voice. "Ask your riddle." The Sphinx's eyes shone with delight. "What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening?" Oedipus's mind raced, turning the words over, searching for the answer that had eluded so many before him. Morning, noon, and evening. 4 legs, 2 legs, then 3. What creature changed like that? Oedipus felt sweat bead on his forehead. One wrong answer, and he would become another nameless corpse decorating the road to Thebes. Think. Morning, noon, and evening. Maybe these were not times of day at all, but stages. Stages of a life. It was so simple, so obvious, yet all those corpses had failed to see it. Oedipus looked up at the Sphinx and spoke, confidence flooding through him. "Man. The answer is man. In the morning of his life, man crawls on all 4s as a baby. At noon, in his prime, he walks on 2 legs, and in the evening, as an old man, he walks with a cane, a 3rd leg to support him." The Sphinx recoiled in horror, toppling backwards as if it had been hit by an invisible blow. Letting out an inhuman shriek, it threw itself from the rock, plummeting to the ground below, where it hit the stones with a sickening crack. Oedipus had done it. He had solved the impossible riddle and saved the city. The gates opened, and the people of Thebes poured out to celebrate their liberator. They carried him on their shoulders through the streets, cheering his name, calling him savior and hero. Within days he was crowned king, and within weeks he married Queen Jocasta, a woman old enough to be his mother, but still beautiful, with a kindness in her eyes that made him feel safe for the first time since he had left Corinth. He did not know, he could not have known, that Jocasta was his mother. The second part of the prophecy had been fulfilled. For many years, Oedipus and Jocasta ruled Thebes together. They had 4 children, 2 daughters and 2 sons, with the city prospering under their rule. Oedipus was a good king, known for being just and wise, and he believed he had escaped the prophecy. He had built a new life, far from Corinth, and he was happy. But then the plague came. It started with the crops. The fields withered, and nothing that was planted would grow. Then the livestock began to die. Then the plague reached the people themselves. Children died in their beds. Women miscarried. Men collapsed in the streets without warning. The city that had thrived under Oedipus's rule was dying, and no one knew why. Oedipus sent his brother-in-law, Creon, to Delphi to consult the oracle, but when Creon returned, his face was pale and his message grim. The plague will not end until the murderer of King Laius is found and punished. His blood still pollutes the city. Oedipus was determined to find this murderer. He had never met Laius, for the old king had died before Oedipus arrived in Thebes, but he vowed to discover who had killed him and bring them to justice. He summoned Theseus, the blind prophet of Thebes, a man who could see the future even though he could not see the present. "Tell me who killed Laius," Oedipus commanded. But Theseus refused. "Do not ask me this," the old man said. "Let the past stay buried." Oedipus grew angry. "You know who the murderer is, and you won't speak? Are you protecting them?" The prophet's blind eyes turned towards the king. "You are the murderer you seek. You killed Laius, and that is only the beginning of the horror." Oedipus was furious. He accused Theseus of lying, of conspiring with Creon to steal the throne. He dismissed the prophet and turned to his wife for reassurance. Jocasta tried to comfort him. "Do not trust prophecies," she said. "They are often wrong. Laius was told he would be killed by his own son, but our child died as an infant on Mount Cithaeron. Laius was killed by bandits at a crossroads years later. See, the prophecy was false." But Oedipus had stopped listening at the word crossroads. His heart began to race. "What crossroads?" he asked. "When did this happen? What did Laius look like?" As Jocasta described her first husband, his age, his appearance, the time of his death, Oedipus felt a cold spreading through his chest. Every detail matched the old man he had killed at the crossroads. Oedipus could not believe what he was hearing. For 3 days he locked himself in his chamber, refusing food or water, refusing even his wife's desperate pleas. The city grew worried for their king. On the 3rd day, a guard knocked with unexpected news. A messenger had arrived from Corinth. King Polybus, the man who had raised Oedipus through his youth, was dead. Oedipus rushed to the throne room. "See," he said to Jocasta almost desperately, "the prophecy was wrong. Polybus was my father, and he died of old age. I did not kill him. Perhaps the oracle was mistaken about everything." But the messenger from Corinth, an old shepherd, saw Oedipus's distress and tried to offer comfort. "My lord," he said gently, "you need not grieve so deeply. Polybus was a good man, but he was not your father by blood. I know this because I am the one who brought you to him as an infant. I found you on Mount Cithaeron, your ankles bound and pierced, and carried you to Corinth myself." Oedipus felt his heart sink. "What do you mean? Who gave me to you?" "A shepherd from Thebes," the Corinthian said. "He could not bear to let you die, as he had been ordered. The king and queen of Thebes had commanded the child be left on the mountain to die. They feared a prophecy that their son would grow up to kill his father." The words hit Oedipus like a blow. The king of Thebes, the son prophesied to kill his father, a baby abandoned with pierced ankles. He looked down at his own feet, at the scars on his ankles that had given him his name, Oedipus, swollen foot. Oedipus stood frozen as the truth crashed down upon him. He had killed his father at the crossroads. He had married his mother. His children were also his siblings. Everything Tiresias had said was true. Everything the prophecy had foretold had come to pass, despite every effort to prevent it. Jocasta had realized it too. "No," she whispered, backing away from the man who was both her son and husband. "No, it cannot be," she cried, fleeing from the room. When Oedipus finally regained his senses, he ran after Jocasta, following her trail to the bedchamber that they shared. But when he threw open the chamber doors, he was met with a sight more horrific than any he could have imagined. The woman who was both his wife and mother, who had borne both him and his children, was hanging from the ceiling beam, her lifeless eyes staring back at him. Oedipus fell to the ground, weeping uncontrollably. He cut the body down, cradled it in his arms, and began to rock back and forth, his entire life having crumbled around him. Then his eyes fell on the golden brooches that fastened Jocasta's robe. He took them in shaking hands and drove them into his own eyes again and again, screaming as the blood ran down his face. "I will not see," he cried. "I will not look upon what I have done." Blind and broken, Oedipus was exiled from the city he had saved, driven out as an abomination. Only his daughter, Antigone, chose to go with him. Taking her father's hand, she led the broken man out of the gates of Thebes to an unknown future. For years afterward, Oedipus wandered Greece as a beggar, blind and broken, guided only by Antigone's gentle voice. People spat at him when they learned his name. They called him cursed, disgraceful, an offense to the gods. He had tried to escape his fate and had instead run straight toward it. He had been the solver of riddles, the saviour of Thebes and its wisest king, and all of it had been built on a foundation of patricide and incest that he had committed unknowingly. He died far from Thebes, an old man worn down by suffering, a reminder that no mortal, no matter how clever or determined, can escape what fate has written for them. The curse of Harmonia's necklace had claimed another victim. Oedipus's children would inherit the same doom, with the bloodline of Cadmus destined to end in tragedy. But elsewhere in Greece, other heroes were rising, with new bloodlines emerging that would shape the age of heroes. Part 3. Perseus. Although the house of Cadmus was the first great heroic family, a new line of heroes would soon emerge from the kingdom of Argos, a powerful city between Athens and Sparta. There ruled King Acrisius, a man whose fear would set in motion events that would spawn one of Greece's greatest heroes. Acrisius had no sons, only a daughter named Danae, and this troubled him greatly. When he consulted the oracle at Delphi, she delivered a prophecy that chilled his blood. "Your daughter will bear a son who will kill you." Despite the threat to his life, Acrisius could not bring himself to kill his beloved daughter. But he could prevent her from ever meeting a man. He built a bronze tower with no doors and only a single window, too small to escape from, and locked his daughter inside. But such obstacles meant nothing to Zeus. Looking down from Olympus, the king of the gods saw Danae imprisoned in her tower and saw only another conquest to be had. He transformed himself into a shower of golden light and poured through the cracks in the bronze walls, falling upon her like rain made of sunlight. And from that union, a son named Perseus was born. When Acrisius discovered his daughter had somehow had a child, he was horrified, yet still he could not bring himself to commit direct murder. Instead, he would leave their fate up to the gods, locking both his daughter and grandson in a wooden chest and having it thrown into the sea. The chest drifted for days, until the waves carried it to Seriphos, a small rocky island in the Aegean, where a fisherman named Dictys found it tangled in his nets. A kind man, Dictys brought them to his home and raised Perseus as his own son, teaching him to fish and navigate the dangerous waters around the island. But Dictys had a brother, and that brother was a problem. King Polydectes ruled Seriphos and desired Danae as his wife, and, like most kings, he would not take no for an answer. The king's ire grew with each rejection she dealt him, until finally the only thing stopping him from taking what he wanted by force was Danae's son, Perseus, a young man of extraordinary strength who always kept his mother close. Soon the king could think of nothing else but finding some way to rid the island of the boy so he could take the woman he believed was his by right. Finally, after months of scheming, an opportunity would present itself. Polydectes had announced that he was planning to marry and had requested that all the noble young men of the island attend a feast in his honor. Yet when they arrived, Perseus included, Polydectes announced that he would begin the feast by collecting a horse as tribute from all his guests, as was custom. It was a calculated decision, for he knew that Perseus, despite his strength and skill, was but a poor fisherman, and had no money with which to buy such a gift. As expected, when the young men presented their horses, Perseus, embarrassed by his lack of an offering, instead made a rash declaration. "I have no horse, but I could bring you a greater gift. I could—" He paused for a minute, thinking about what he could offer. "I could bring you the head of Medusa, the Gorgon." Gasps rang out around the hall. All had heard of the terrifying creature whose gaze turned men to stone, and all knew that none who had sought her out had ever returned. But King Polydectes only smiled. "I accept. Bring me Medusa's head." Perseus left the feast, knowing he had been manipulated into an impossible task, but honour bound to complete it anyway. But Perseus, as with all of Zeus's children, was never truly alone. As he prepared to leave the island, two figures appeared to him on the shore, Hermes and Athena. "Your boast was foolish, but brave," Hermes said. "The gods have watched you grow, Perseus. Your father cannot openly intervene, for Hera always watches, but he has sent me to help, along with the other god who has an interest in Medusa's fate." Athena stepped forward, her grey eyes cold. "Medusa was once my priestess," she said, the venom clear in her voice. "She defiled my temple and broke her sacred vows. I want her dead, but I cannot kill her myself without appearing petty. You, however, can do it for me." She offered him a shield, polished to such perfection that he could see his own reflection in its bronze surface. "Never look directly at her," Athena warned, "for her gaze turns flesh to stone in an instant. But the reflection in the shield will diminish the curse's power, giving you a few moments to strike before the magic takes hold." Hermes then handed Perseus a sword, the likes of which he had never seen. "Adamantine," Hermes explained, "unbreakable and sharp enough to cut through anything, even a Gorgon's neck." He reached into his travelling cloak and produced a number of items, handing them to the young hero. "Winged sandals," he explained, "so you can fly to where she hides. Hades' helm of invisibility, so you can approach unseen, and an enchanted bag that will contain Medusa's head safely, as her gaze remains deadly even after death." Perseus took the gifts, overwhelmed by their weight and significance. "Where do I find her?" Athena and Hermes exchanged glances. "That knowledge is not ours to give," Hermes said carefully. "Only 3 beings know where the Gorgons hide. The Graeae, the Grey Sisters. They are the Gorgons' aunts, and they will not give up the information willingly. You will find them at the edge of the world, where twilight never ends." "And how do I convince them to tell me?" Perseus asked. Athena's lips curved into a smile. "You're a clever young man. You will find a way." The Grey Sisters. Perseus flew west until he reached a place where the light never changed, a perpetual grey twilight that cast no shadows. The landscape here was colourless and desolate, covered in fine ash that stirred in a wind that never quite stopped blowing. He heard them before he saw them, 3 voices arguing in the gloom. "Sister, the eye! I cannot see!" one voice called out. "Wait your turn, I'm still looking," another replied. "But I have been waiting," a third shouted angrily. "You have had it for hours." Perseus descended quietly, the helm rendering him invisible. 3 ancient figures sat hunched around a small fire, their skin grey and papery, their hair long and colourless. These were the Graeae, and as Perseus watched, he saw that the sisters shared more than just blood. Between the 3 of them, they shared a single eye and a single tooth, passed back and forth in endless argument. One of the sisters held it now, pressing the yellowed orb into her empty socket and looking around at the barren landscape with an expression of profound boredom. "Nothing," she muttered. "There is never anything to see in this cursed place." "Then give it to me," another sister demanded, reaching out with gnarled fingers. "And the tooth, I'm hungry." The first sister plucked the eye from her socket and held it out. At the same moment, the second sister passed across the single yellowed tooth. For just a moment, as the items exchanged hands, all 3 sisters were blind and toothless. Perseus saw his chance. Creeping forward, he snatched both eye and tooth from the air before either sister could grasp it.
"Where is it?"
one shrieked, her empty hands grasping at nothing.
"Sister, do you see the tooth?" "How could I see the tooth when I don't have the eye?" the first replied. "You must have dropped it."
All three began groping frantically in the grey ash, blind and confused.
"Who has taken them?"
the eldest croaked.
"Who dares steal from the grey eye?"
Perseus removed his helm, visible now in the gloom. "I have." The three sisters turned their empty sockets towards his voice.
"A man!"
one hissed.
"A thief! Give them back!"
another demanded.
"Return what you have stolen or face our curse!"
"I need something from you first," Perseus said, confident in his power over them. "Tell me where Medusa hides, and I will return your eye and tooth." The three sisters fell silent. Then the eldest spoke, her voice filled with sorrow.
"You seek our niece. She is not what you think. She was beautiful once, kind, before the gods."
"It matters not what she was," the youngest interrupted.
"Tell him and be done with it. We cannot live without our sight."
The eldest relented.
"The Gorgons dwell on the Libyan coast, where the land meets the sea. There is a cave there, marked by statues, warriors who sought glory and found only stone. You cannot miss it."
"Thank you," Perseus said, tossing the eye and tooth back towards them. One sister caught the eye and pressed it into her socket, glaring at him with such hatred that he took a step back.
"You may have what you came for," she spat, "but hear this, son of Zeus. The blood you spill will return to haunt you. We curse you with the fate you deserve."
Perseus felt a chill run through him as he fastened the helm and took to the air, their voices fading behind him as they cursed his name into the grey twilight. The Gorgon's Head. The Grey Eye had sought to protect Medusa, not just because she was their niece, but because they knew her story, one unknown to Perseus and the other heroes that had come to hunt her across the years. Before she became a monster, Medusa had been a woman, humble and kind, and a devoted priestess of Athena. She had sworn a vow of celibacy as part of her service to the goddess, but, as with many attractive young women in Greece, she had caught the attention of a god. Poseidon, upon seeing her one day on the shore, decided he wanted her for his own. Following her back to Athena's temple, he came inside in a great torrent of brine and salt water and forced himself upon her. The temple was ruined, the walls stained, and offerings washed away, with Medusa's vow of celibacy having been broken against her will. Athena was furious at the desecration of her sacred space, but with no way to punish her powerful uncle Poseidon, instead turned her fury on the helpless priestess. She cursed Medusa, transforming her once beautiful features into something monstrous. Her hair became writhing serpents, while her gaze became so horrifying as to turn any who looked upon her to stone. Medusa's two sisters, who tried to defend her, were transformed as well, with the three coming to be known as the Gorgons. Exiled from their homeland, the three sisters found a cave on the Libyan coast, where they tried to hide away in shame. But word soon spread of the terrifying Gorgons, with warriors from far and wide arriving to hunt them for sport and glory, seeing little more than monsters to be slain. As the years passed and men kept trying to kill them, the sisters became more vicious and hostile, with Medusa transforming into the very monster Athena had made her. And so, as Perseus approached Medusa's cave, decades after her transformation, all he saw were the brutal remnants of her kills. The approach was littered with hundreds of stone statues, each one frozen in their last moments of terror. Some of the statues were charging forward with spears raised, while others were begging on their knees, but all had expressions of pure horror etched forever on their features. Perseus donned his helm of invisibility and crept through the statues. Two of the Gorgons paced near the entrance, their serpent hair writhing, but he had little to fear from them, as it was only Medusa's gaze that could turn men to stone. Making his way into the deepest depths of the cave, he finally found her, her serpentine body coiled up among the petrified remains of her victims. Perseus crept forward, using only the reflection in Athena's shield to guide him as he neared, but as he came next to her, a loud crack sounded beneath his sandal. Looking down in horror, he saw a petrified arm snapped in two beneath his foot. The snakes in Medusa's hair looked up and began to hiss. Her eyes began to open. Perseus had but seconds to strike. He swung the adamantine sword in a single arc, guided by the reflection. The blade cut through Medusa's neck cleanly, and her head fell before her eyes could focus. Her sisters shrieked in rage, but Perseus grabbed the head by its serpent hair, shoved it into the enchanted bag, and ran for the cave entrance. As he did, something extraordinary happened. From Medusa's severed neck, two forms emerged. Chrysaor, a warrior born fully armed, and Pegasus, a magnificent winged horse of pure white. These were Poseidon's children, conceived during the assault in Athena's temple, having been growing inside her all this time. Pegasus spread his wings and bolted for the cave entrance. Perseus, with little time to think, ran after the horse. He caught Pegasus just outside the cave and leapt onto his back. The horse didn't resist, taking flight and rising into the sky as Medusa's sisters emerged below, crying out in anguish at the death of their beloved sister. Andromeda. As Perseus and Pegasus soared over the Libyan desert, blood from Medusa's severed head began seeping through the enchanted bag, dripping down onto the sands far below. Where each drop landed sprang serpents of every kind, vipers, asps, and cobras, which would spread across the desert. From that day forward, Libya would be known as a land of serpents, a final curse left by Medusa, even in death. But as Perseus neared the coast, he found himself embroiled in yet another dispute between a mortal and the gods. Queen Cassiopeia of Ethiopia was known far and wide for her incredible beauty, a fact that had seen her arrogance grow to unbearable heights. She had declared herself the most beautiful woman on earth, setting up mirrors about her palace so that she could see her reflection day and night. But it was not enough. Now she had gone further, claiming that her beauty surpassed even the Nereids, the sacred companions of Poseidon, a foolish comment considering her kingdom was built on the coast. Within days, Poseidon had flooded the kingdom, sending the sea monster Cetus to kill its people and prevent any from coming near. When Cassiopeia had desperately consulted an oracle on how to appease the god, her worst fears would be realized when it declared that only the sacrifice of her daughter, Andromeda, would end the attacks. And so it was that Perseus, flying over the coastline, saw a young woman bound to a rock, naked and helpless as the waves washed over her. He descended to investigate, asking the woman her name and story. Perseus listened carefully as she revealed all before responding. "This is unjust," he said. "You should not die for words your mother spoke." "Justice and fate are rarely the same thing," Andromeda replied. "You ride a winged horse and carry a sword. Are you a hero?" "I am trying to be," he said, puffing out his chest slightly. "Then I suppose you have come to fight the monster," Andromeda replied, hope clear in her voice. "Can you kill it?" "I have already killed a Gorgon," Perseus assured her. "A sea monster should be no problem." Without another word, he was up in the air, hiding in the clouds as he watched for the monster to approach. He would not have to wait long. The sea began to churn, then burst open as Cetus erupted from the depths. He was a serpent easily the length of 10 ships, covered in scales black as midnight. The creature rushed towards Andromeda, its massive jaws open, ready to accept the sacrifice. But then Perseus was on him, slashing and hacking at the creature's eyes. Cetus thrashed, confused, trying desperately to find his attacker, but Perseus was too fast, driving his unbreakable sword into fins and gills, cutting at the soft scales beneath its jaws. Finally, Perseus saw an opening and drove his sword deep into Cetus's skull, the light fading from the creature's eyes as it sank back beneath the waves. The monster slain, Perseus freed Andromeda from her chains and took her back to the shore, where the entire city had been watching. Queen Cassiopeia embraced her daughter with tears in her eyes, thanking Perseus for his miraculous intervention and offering him the only thing worthy of such a feat, her daughter's hand in marriage. Perseus accepted, and the two wed that evening. Setting out to Seriphos the following morning, Perseus carried not just the Gorgon's head, but also a wife of his own choosing, with the two ready to start a new life together. But that could wait. For now his mother was still in danger, and Perseus was the only one who could save her. The fate of King Polydectes. When Perseus arrived at Seriphos, he found that things were worse than he had feared. Without Perseus to oppose him, King Polydectes had turned to violence to force Danae to wed him. She had fled with the fisherman Dictys, seeking refuge in the temple of Athena, sacred ground even the king would not violate. But over a week had passed, and the two had run out of supplies, with it only a matter of time before they had to choose between starvation and submission. Perseus saw the commotion from the sky as he approached, flying directly to the temple which the king's soldiers had surrounded. Jumping off his steed, he sent Pegasus and Andromeda away to safety before turning to the king and his guards. "I have returned," he announced, holding up the bloody bag. "I have the gift you requested." Polydectes laughed nervously, clearly unnerved at seeing the boy arrive on a winged horse. "You expect me to believe you killed Medusa? No, you lie. You must be gods." He gestured to the men around him. "Kill this liar." The soldiers began to creep forward. Perseus was strong, but taking on 24 armed men was too much, even for a son of Zeus. But he did not need to. Reaching down into the enchanted bag, he pulled out Medusa's head, shielding his eyes as he held it out before him. Polydectes' expression shifted from contempt to horror as his skin hardened to stone. The guards rushed forward to stop Perseus, but it was too late. Within seconds, Medusa's gaze had done its work, with the chaos of the final confrontation forever immortalized in stone. Perseus returned the head to his bag and opened the doors to the temple, finding his mother and Dictys inside. The three of them embraced, laughing and weeping together, finally free from Polydectes' tyranny. The next few weeks were filled with joy. Perseus introduced his new wife to his mother and, forever grateful to Dictys for protecting his mother, made the old fisherman king of the island, with his reign to be marked by peace and prosperity. His journey over, Perseus returned the gifts the gods had given him to Athena's temple, alongside Medusa's head, for he no longer had any need of it. Athena, upon retrieving the head, decided she had not finished with her old priestess. She took the head and affixed it to her aegis, the divine breastplate she wore into battle, where it would stay forevermore. Medusa, who had suffered so much in life, would find no peace even in death. Whenever Athena went to war, Medusa would come with her, her terrifying gaze breaking the minds of men who dared to oppose the goddess. The prophecy fulfilled. With his mother safe, Perseus decided to return to Argos, the land of his birth, hoping to learn the truth of his past and make peace with his grandfather. He took Andromeda and Danae and flew to the city, one final trip on Pegasus before the creature departed to Olympus, where the gods still had plans for the divine horse. But when they arrived, Perseus quickly discovered that his grandfather, Acrisius, had abandoned the throne and fled when news had arrived of his grandson's return, still fearful of the prophecy learned years ago. Although he was disappointed that he would not be able to meet his grandfather, Perseus decided he still wanted to make himself known in his homeland, with a local athletic tournament being the perfect opportunity to win himself glory. As the tournament began, Perseus would win event after event, the blood of Zeus showing true. Perseus, however, had still not learnt his own strength, and when it was his turn in the discus competition, he launched it with all his might. The discus flew farther than anyone had ever thrown, sailing over the field and into the crowd of spectators. A cry went up. Someone had been struck. Perseus ran towards the commotion and found an old man lying on the ground, blood seeping from a wound on his temple. It was Acrisius. He had been watching in disguise. Despite his fear, he had returned to see his grandson compete, and as he watched Perseus win challenge after challenge, he had even begun to cheer. "That's my grandson!" he had cried out. "Have you ever seen a discus thrown like that?" They were the last words he ever spoke. Fate could not be denied. Despite every precaution, the imprisonment and banishment of his family, his desperate attempts to hide, the oracle's prophecy had still been fulfilled, and Acrisius had been struck down by his grandson in the very moment he finally accepted him. Perseus was distraught when he realized the truth and knew he could not remain in Argos. The killing of family, deliberate or otherwise, polluted not just the killer, but the entire community. Instead, he travelled north and founded his own city, a place called Mycenae. With the help of the Cyclops, he built walls with such enormous stones that later Greeks would call them Cyclopean walls, believing no ordinary humans could have moved them. It was from this city that Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek forces during the Trojan War, would one day rule, amassing more wealth and power than any king had before him. But for now, Perseus ruled from Mycenae. He and Andromeda had many children, and their descendants would rule the region for generations, kings and queens tracing their lineage back to the blood of Zeus. And one day, many years later, one of these descendants would give birth to a son who would become the greatest hero Greece had ever known. That son's name would be Heracles, and his story would become famed throughout the world. But before that great champion was born, before his labours shook the world, there was another hero whose tale served as a warning about the dangers of pride. His name was Bellerophon, and his rise and fall would be inextricably linked to the winged horse that Perseus had set free. Part 4. Bellerophon. Not all heroes were destined for glory. Some rose high only to fall further, their pride becoming the instrument of their own destruction. Such was the fate of Bellerophon, a man who would learn that the gifts of the gods could be taken away as easily as they were given. Bellerophon was the grandson of Sisyphus, the king who had cheated death twice and now spent eternity in Tartarus, pushing a boulder up a hill. Perhaps arrogance ran in the blood, as Bellerophon inherited his grandfather's fatal flaw, the belief that cleverness and courage could elevate a mortal to the level of the gods. He was a prince of Corinth, strong and skilled in combat, but his life took a dark turn when he accidentally killed a man during a hunt. Fleeing his homeland, he sought refuge with King Iobates of Lycia. The king received him with courtesy, as guest friendship demanded, but privately, Iobates had received a letter suggesting that Bellerophon was dangerous and should be disposed of. The king, however, could not kill a guest directly, as that would violate sacred law, but he could send Bellerophon on a quest so dangerous that death would be almost certain. There was a monster terrorizing the countryside, a creature so terrible that no warrior had ever returned from facing it. The Chimera was a nightmare made flesh. The unnatural merger of three creatures, it had 2 heads, one of a lion and one of a goat, with a venomous serpent for a tail. Worst of all, it breathed fire, incinerating anyone who came close enough to attack. It had been ravaging the Lycian countryside for months, burning fields and devouring livestock, with the kingdom having reached its breaking point. Bellerophon eagerly accepted the quest, not knowing it was meant to be his death sentence. But he was not entirely without help. He consulted the seer, Polyeidos, who told him what he must do. "You cannot defeat the Chimera on foot. You need to attack from above. Go to Athena's temple tonight and sleep there. She may grant you what you need." That night, as Bellerophon slept in the temple, Athena appeared to him in a dream. "You seek to kill the Chimera," Athena said bluntly. "I do, my lady," Bellerophon replied, "but I do not know how." Athena held out a golden bridle, the headgear used to control a horse, intricately wrought with a skill that could only have been divine in origin. "The winged horse Pegasus drinks from a spring on Mount Helicon. He is wild and proud, and though Perseus once rode him, the horse has never been bound to any mortal. But this bridle will allow you to claim him as your own." When Bellerophon woke, the bridle lay beside him. He travelled to Mount Helicon, found the spring exactly as Athena had described, and there, drinking from the crystal-clear water, was Pegasus. The horse was magnificent, his coat pure white, brighter than fresh snow. When he saw Bellerophon approaching, Pegasus reared back, ready to take flight, but Bellerophon moved carefully, speaking softly, holding the golden bridle where the horse could see it. There was something about the bridle, some divine enchantment woven into it by Athena, that put Pegasus at ease. He lowered his head and allowed Bellerophon to slip the bridle over his ears. The moment it was in place, the bond was formed. Bellerophon climbed onto his back, and together they took to the sky. Soaring over mountains and valleys, with Bellerophon experiencing a rush unlike anything he had felt before, it was not long before they arrived at the Chimera's lair. The monster had made its home in a cave on a rocky mountainside. The ground was scorched black for miles around, littered with the charred bones of men and cattle. As Bellerophon and Pegasus descended, the Chimera emerged, all 3 heads turning up at once. It was even more terrible up close. The lion's head roared, flames licking from its jaws, while the goat shrieked and the serpent spat venom through the air. The creature was massive, easily the size of 4 horses, and its eyes burned with a hunger that promised no mercy. As the hero drew near, the Chimera breathed a torrent of fire, a roaring column of heat that would have incinerated Bellerophon had it hit, but Pegasus was fast, darting aside, wings beating powerfully as they climbed higher. Bellerophon drew his bow and loosed arrow after arrow, striking the Chimera's flanks, but the creature's hide was thick, the arrows causing frustration more than damage. He needed a different approach. The beasts seemed most vulnerable where the different creatures attached to each other, but they were too well guarded to be shot from afar. If he wanted any chance of taking the monster down, he would have to risk everything by getting close. Drawing his spear, Bellerophon urged Pegasus into a dive. He steadied his arm as they fell. He knew he only had one chance to get this right. They plummeted towards the Chimera at terrible speed, and at the last moment, Bellerophon drove the spear down with all his strength into the creature's back, between the shoulders where the goat's body met the lion's neck. The Chimera shrieked, a sound like metal tearing. It thrashed and bucked, trying to throw off the spear, but Bellerophon held on, driving it deeper. Finally, with one last shuddering breath, the monster collapsed, its flames guttering out, its serpent tail going limp. Bellerophon landed beside the corpse, breathing hard, covered in sweat and ash. He had achieved the impossible. He had killed the Chimera. When he returned to King Iobates, the king could scarcely believe it. He sent the hero on more impossible quests, but Bellerophon succeeded in every task, always with Pegasus at his side. His fame spread across Greece. People spoke of him in the same breath as Cadmus and Perseus. They called him God-blessed, a man singled out by the immortals for greatness. And soon enough, Bellerophon began to believe them. He had killed the unkillable Chimera. He had defeated armies. Was he not extraordinary? Was he not worthy of recognition from the gods themselves? The more he thought about it, the more the idea took hold. Perhaps he was meant to sit among the gods. Perhaps they were waiting for him to claim his rightful place. One morning, Bellerophon climbed onto Pegasus's back and turned the horse's head toward the sky. "Take me to Olympus," he said. Pegasus hesitated. The horse's ears flicked back, uncertain, but Bellerophon urged him on, and the horse, bound by Athena's bridle, began to climb. They flew higher than they had ever flown before. The world became small, the mountains like wrinkles in cloth, the seas like pools of water. The air grew thin and cold, yet still they climbed, heading toward the realm of the gods. Zeus, sitting on his throne, watched the mortal approach. His expression darkened. The gods had not summoned this man. He had not been invited. He was simply a mortal, a proud, arrogant mortal, who thought he could fly to Olympus uninvited, as if the halls of the gods were open to anyone with a winged horse. Zeus raised one hand, and a tiny creature appeared in the air before Pegasus, a gadfly, no larger than a fingernail. The insect darted forward and stung Pegasus on the flank, causing the horse to rear back in shock. The gadfly stung again, and Pegasus flailed in confusion, his wings folding, his body twisting. Bellerophon, caught completely by surprise, lost his grip and fell. He screamed as he plummeted through the sky, watching Pegasus disappear above him. The ground rushed up to meet him, fields and rocks, and finally a dense thicket of thorn bushes that broke his fall but tore his body to shreds. Bellerophon did not die. Perhaps that would have been kinder. He survived, his body battered and broken, his eyes pierced by thorns, leaving him blind. When farmers found him days later, they did not recognize the broken, bleeding man as the great hero who had killed the Chimera. For the rest of his life, Bellerophon wandered Greece as a blind exile, spurned by the gods and forgotten by the people who had once celebrated him. He had flown higher than any mortal, and he had fallen further than most could imagine. The price for comparing oneself to the gods. Pegasus, meanwhile, completed the journey to Olympus. Zeus claimed the winged horse for himself, and from that day forward, Pegasus served the king of the gods, carrying his thunder and lightning across the heavens. The horse that had once belonged to no one now belonged to Olympus, and there he would remain for all time, a reminder that even the most wondrous gifts were never truly ours to keep. Part 5. Heracles. Zeus looked down from Mount Olympus and saw a Greece consumed by chaos. Cities burned, kingdoms fought endless wars, and monsters prowled the land. A few heroes had already emerged, Cadmus, Perseus, and Bellerophon, but they were not enough to take on all the dangers threatening the world. What Greece needed was a champion with divine blood, a hero strong enough to face what ordinary men could not. Zeus naturally decided to father this hero himself. When selecting the mother, his gaze settled on Alcmena of Thebes, a descendant of Perseus who would provide a strong bloodline. He approached Alcmena in the form of her husband, and the child was conceived that very night. When Zeus returned to Olympus, he proudly swore an oath that he would make the next descendant of Perseus the ruler of Tiryns and the most powerful king in Greece. The Olympians accepted his decree without question, all except for one. The insult was too much for Hera to bear. For countless generations she had put up with Zeus's unending infidelities, but this was too blatant, too insulting for her to ignore. She would make him suffer for this, and the tool of her revenge would be the very oath he had sworn. As Alcmena's pregnancy neared its end, Hera commanded Ilithyia, the goddess of childbirth, to delay the birth. For 7 agonizing days, Alcmena labored in terrible pain, while Hera used her power to speed up a different pregnancy in Tiryns. A queen there, also carrying a descendant of Perseus, gave birth prematurely to a boy named Eurystheus. When Heracles finally emerged, hours later, it was too late. Zeus was bound by his sacred oath to give the kingship to Eurystheus, the first descendant of Perseus to be born, weak and cowardly though he would grow up to be. But Zeus devised his own revenge. One night he stole into Hera's bedchamber and placed the infant Heracles on her breast while she slept. The baby nursed hungrily, absorbing her divine power, her immortal essence strengthening his muscles beyond those of any mortal. When Hera finally awoke, she threw the baby from her chest in a fit of rage, causing her divine milk to spray across the heavens in a great arc, the droplets crystallizing into countless stars. This became the Milky Way, a permanent reminder of her humiliation written across the night sky. That very night, Hera decided to end this feud once and for all, sending 2 venomous serpents into the nursery where Heracles slept. They reared over his cradle, fangs bared, but when they lunged, baby Heracles seized one in each fist, giggling as he crushed them with his divine strength. When Alcmena rushed in, drawn by the baby's laughter, she found him holding 2 dead snakes, shaking them around like toys. Furious at seeing her plans foiled yet again, Hera made a solemn vow. If she could not kill Heracles directly, she would ensure his life was filled with unbearable suffering. The madness of Heracles. Growing up in the city of Thebes, Heracles developed into a young man of incredible strength and skill. For a time, he lived a happy life, marrying the Theban princess Megara and filling their home with the laughter of 3 healthy sons. But Hera was watching. The Queen of Olympus looked down with venom in her heart. The child who had stolen her divine power now prospered with a loving family and the adoration of an entire city. This insult could not stand. The time had come to destroy Heracles in a way that no amount of strength could prevent. When Heracles returned home one afternoon, he found his door hanging off its hinges. Drawing his sword and rushing inside, he would find 3 massive creatures prowling about his home, fanged and covered in scales, with his family nowhere to be seen. Rage consumed Heracles at the sight of them. He threw himself at the creatures, crushing the skull of one against the stone floor while strangling another with his bare hands. Even after they stopped moving, he continued striking, driven by a fury that seemed to come from outside himself. Only when his arms grew too heavy to move did the rage finally fade, and with it Hera's illusion lifted from his eyes. The monsters vanished like smoke. Where the hideous creatures had been, now lay his family. Megara was sprawled near the fountain, her skull crushed. His eldest son lay by the doorway, his throat bearing purple finger marks, and against the wall was his youngest boy, his twisted body barely recognizable. Heracles fell to his knees among the bodies, unable to stand. His wife and children lay dead before him, killed by his own hands. Everything he had built, everything he loved, was gone. And worse was coming. The Furies would hunt him now, those ancient spirits of vengeance who pursued all those who murdered their own king, relentless and unforgiving. There was only one place where he might find atonement: the oracle at Delphi, the sacred shrine where Apollo spoke through the priestess. Arriving at the ancient temple, Heracles knelt before the Pythia and begged to know how he could atone for what he had done. The priestess inhaled the sacred smoke and fell into a trance. When she spoke, her voice carried Apollo's judgment, though Hera had poisoned the prophecy with her magic. "You must serve King Eurystheus of Mycenae as a slave for 10 full years. Whatever he commands, you must obey. Only if you complete this service will the Furies cease their hunt, and your soul be made clean." Heracles stood silent. So this is what he was reduced to? Serving Eurystheus, the weak, cowardly king who had stolen his birthright by Hera's trickery. The irony was not lost on him. But outside the temple he could hear the Furies circling, their wings beating against the night, waiting for him to refuse. He had no choice. He bowed his head in acceptance and began the long journey to Mycenae, where his cousin waited to give him his first impossible task. The Nemean Lion. King Eurystheus had known of Heracles for years and deeply resented him. Where Heracles was tall and powerfully built, Eurystheus was thin and pale, having inherited his throne through Hera's trickery. When Heracles arrived at Mycenae to begin his servitude, Eurystheus could barely suppress his delight at seeing the mighty hero brought low. "You will complete 12 labors," the king announced. "Each task I set you must accomplish alone and without assistance. You will receive no payment, no glory. These are my terms." Heracles kept his eyes on the floor. "I understand." Eurystheus wasted no time setting his first labor. Heracles was to travel to the hills above Nemea, where a monstrous lion had been terrorizing the countryside for years. Its hide could not be pierced by any weapon. It had slaughtered shepherds in their fields, dragged farmers from their homes, and devoured travelers on the roads. 30 soldiers sent to kill it had never returned. For any normal man, this task would have been a death sentence. But Heracles was no normal man. For 3 months he prepared, carrying boulders up steep slopes and uprooting ancient oaks until he could crush stones to powder with his bare hands. Finally ready, he made his way to Nemea. When he reached the lion's cave, wading through the bones of its countless victims, he stood and called into the darkness,
"Lion of Nemea, I am Heracles, and I have come for you."
A growl rumbled from deep within. Then the beast emerged, far larger than any normal lion, with a golden hide and a mane thick as tangled thorns. Heracles realized this was no ordinary creature, but a child of Typhon and Echidna, the divine beings who had spawned the greatest monsters the world had ever known. The lion lowered its head and charged, the ground shaking as it built speed. Waiting until the last second, Heracles dove aside and wrapped his arms around its neck from behind. The lion roared and thrashed, trying to shake him off, but to no avail. They rolled across the rocky ground, the lion's weight shattering rocks beneath them, but still Heracles held on, his hands locked beneath the beast's jaw. For hours they struggled until, as darkness approached, the lion began to tire, its roars becoming gasps. Heracles shifted his grip to its throat and squeezed with every last ounce of power in his body. The beast gave a final shudder, then was still. Heracles collapsed beside it, exhausted. When enough strength returned that he could stand, he tried to skin the lion to claim his prize, but found that nothing could pierce the hide. As he was about to admit defeat, he suddenly remembered the lion's own claws, which were sharp enough to slice through the toughest of armor. Taking one, he found it could cut through the golden pelt, where all else had failed. He draped the lion's skin over his shoulders, using the beast's head as a hood. The hide that no weapon could pierce would now protect him during his labors. As he left the cave, he found a massive oak tree and tore it from the earth with his bare hands, carving the trunk into a heavy club. This would be his weapon now, simple and direct, like the path before him. Heracles arrived back in Mycenae, a man transformed. He had left as a broken murderer, still clinging to the remnants of his old life. But now he wore the skin of a beast he had killed with his bare hands and carried a club torn from the earth itself. His first labor was complete, and he felt invincible, ready to face any challenge Eurystheus or the gods put before him. The labors of Heracles. For the next several years, the labors continued. Eurystheus would send Heracles to every corner of Greece, assigning him increasingly impossible tasks in his attempt to find something, anything, that would cause his cousin to fail. He challenged the fearsome nine-headed Hydra at Lake Lerna, only to discover that strength alone was not enough, for when he cut off one head, two more grew in its place. Only by working with his nephew, Iolaus, to cauterize the stumps with fire before they regenerated did he finally slay the beast, achieving a second task all had thought impossible. To mark his victory, he dipped his arrows in the beast's poisonous blood, creating a weapon so deadly that the slightest scratch could kill even an immortal. He captured the sacred deer of Artemis, a creature that ran as fast as the wind itself, and would wrestle the fearsome bull of Crete into submission. He cleaned out the stables of King Augeas by diverting 2 rivers through them, accomplishing in a day what should have taken years. There was no creature, mortal or divine, that could stand up to his strength. He stole fire-breathing horses from the mad king of Thrace, cleaned out an entire swarm of man-eating birds from Lake Stymphalus, and even travelled to the edge of the world to steal the cattle of the giant Geryon, raising 2 mighty monuments, the Pillars of Hercules, to mark his achievement. Labor after labor, year after year, Heracles continued to see success. He had killed monsters and saved kingdoms, with his name sung by bards across the land. Soon Eurystheus had exhausted not only all the trials in Greece, but those of neighbouring kingdoms as well. With every challenge in the mortal world having been completed, he would now send Heracles beyond the boundaries of the known world to the realms of gods and immortals, where no hero had gone before. Yet even here, facing tasks that would have challenged the gods themselves, Heracles continued to see success. He petitioned the great Titan Atlas, bearer of the sky, to help him steal a basket of golden apples that could grant immortality. Atlas agreed, but in exchange, Heracles had to hold the very sky on his back for a brief but agonizing time, stars digging into his back as the very weight of existence bore down on him, pushing even Heracles to his considerable limits. And, finally, he travelled to the underworld itself, where he wrestled Cerberus, the three-headed guardian of the dead, into submission, dragging him before Eurystheus as proof of his achievement. Heracles had completed all the labours that had been set before him. He had atoned for his crimes, and finally he was free. A great hero had risen, becoming so strong that Greece was now rid of nearly all the terrible creatures that had once plagued it, with mankind able to flourish once more. Yet, despite his incredible achievements, despite his fame and glory, there would be no rest for the hero, no happy ending waiting for him. Death was coming, and when it arrived, it would not come from any monster or god. It would come from the one he cherished most. The death of Heracles. Heracles took time to celebrate his freedom, joining many great adventures across the years, even Jason and the Argonauts on their quest for the Golden Fleece. But as the seasons turned and streaks of grey began to appear in his hair, Heracles thought it time to settle down. He found a young bride in Calydon, a woman named Deianira, and soon the two were wed. Before long the newlyweds set out for their new home in the city of Tiryns, travelling along the dusty mountain paths. Their journey was peaceful until they reached the river Evenus, where the spring floods had transformed the usually calm waters into a raging torrent. As Heracles studied the treacherous crossing, calculating how best to ford the waters while keeping his new bride safe, a centaur emerged from the opposite bank.
"Great Heracles," the centaur called, "I am a ferryman of these waters. Allow me to carry your bride across on my back."
Heracles, concerned for Deianira's safety, accepted what appeared to be a generous offer. It would turn out to be the greatest mistake he would ever make. Years ago, on the way to his fourth labour, Heracles had come into conflict with a tribe of hostile centaurs near this very river, with the hero killing each and every one of them with his poisoned arrows. Or so he thought. One centaur had managed to survive the massacre. His name was Nessus, and after a decade of planning his revenge, he had just managed to convince Heracles to put his new wife on his back. As soon as his hooves touched the far bank, Nessus put his revenge into action, throwing Deianira to the ground, his intentions horrifyingly clear. Heracles flew into action, his old instincts returning in an instant. Pulling out his bow, he fired a poisoned arrow which punched through the centaur's chest with terrible force. Nessus staggered backward, the poison already taking effect, dark blood pooling beneath him. In his last moments, Nessus beckoned Deianira closer.
"Lady," he wheezed, "I beg your forgiveness. My blood carries the power of love. Collect it in a vial. Should Heracles ever stray, anoint his clothing with it, and his heart will return to you alone. This I swear by the river Styx."
Shaken, Deianira filled a small vial with the centaur's blood and hid it among her belongings, never suspecting she had become an accomplice in the dying creature's revenge. The couple continued on to Tiryns, where they lived happily for years, having several children together and forgetting the horrific incident entirely. But after several years of peace, Heracles grew restless. The quiet life weighed on him. He would stand on the city walls gazing towards distant mountains, remembering the thrill of adventure. One day he simply disappeared, with Deianira left to care for their children alone, not sure when or if her husband would ever come back home. Months passed, until one day, while tending the gardens, she heard a cry from the streets outside. "Heracles is back! The great hero has returned!" Deianira rushed to the gates, desperate to embrace her husband, but the sight that met her turned her blood to ice. Accompanying Heracles was a horde of captured women, stolen from the neighbouring kingdom of Icalia, and among them was a woman, Iole, young and beautiful, who the great hero was looking at with love in his eyes. She watched as Heracles helped Iole down from her horse, his hands lingering on her waist, his touch tender and protective. That gesture told Deianira everything. That night, desperate to regain her husband's affections, Deianira retrieved the hidden vial of Nessus's blood. She selected one of Heracles' finest robes and smeared the blood across the inside of the fabric before asking him to wear it to dinner. When Heracles pulled the robe over his shoulders, he noticed nothing at first, just a slight warmth, a faint tingling, but then the pain began. The tingling progressed into a burning unlike anything he had ever experienced. The blood of Nessus, tainted with Hydra's poison, began to activate, the centaur's revenge finally taking effect. The fabric melted into Heracles' skin, fusing with his flesh as if made of molten metal. Heracles let out a roar that shook the walls. He tried to tear the robe off, but as he pulled, he tore away not just cloth, but chunks of his own flesh. Servants desperately threw water over him, but nothing could wash away the poison eating through his body. Heracles' torment continued through the night. He stumbled into the courtyard, screaming. The poison that had killed so many now worked its terrible magic on the greatest hero of Greece. Knowing death was approaching, he began tearing up young trees with his bare hands, constructing his own funeral pyre. When the pyre was assembled, Heracles climbed to its top. His body was a ruin, flesh hanging in tatters. He called out to his friend, Philoctetes. "Light it!" Heracles gasped. "End this torment!" Philoctetes wept as he brought the torch to the wood. The flames raced upward. As the fire reached Heracles, a smile appeared on his ravaged face, for he knew the agony would end at last. But this was not the end for Greece's greatest hero. As the flames consumed the last of Heracles' earthly body, Zeus appeared and reached down through the smoke and fire. His divine hand grasped not flesh, but spirit, pulling forth the immortal essence of Heracles and bringing it up to Olympus. There, in the halls of the gods, Zeus transformed his son into an immortal. After years of trials and torment, after losing everything he held dear, his labors were finally, truly complete. Part 6. Theseus. If Heracles was the strongest hero Greece ever produced, then Theseus of Athens was the most complete. He possessed not only strength and courage, but also intelligence and cunning, the qualities that would make Athens the greatest city in all of Greece. But before he could unite the scattered villages of Attica into a single kingdom, before he could face the Minotaur in its labyrinth, he first had to discover who he truly was. His story begins with his father, King Aegeus, who had ruled Athens for many years. Having tried and failed countless times to father an heir to whom he could leave his kingdom, believing he was incapable of having children, Aegeus travelled to Delphi and asked the oracle for help. She instructed him to journey to the small kingdom of Trojan, where the city's princess, Aethra, would bear him a son. Overjoyed, Aegeus travelled to Trojan and met with Princess Aethra, and the two conceived a child that night. However, unknown to Aegeus, Poseidon also visited Aethra that same evening. The child that was born, Theseus, carried the blood of both men, mortal king and sea god alike. With Poseidon's divine essence running through his veins, Theseus would be granted immense agility and strength, gifts that would prove essential in the trials ahead. But King Aegeus, knowing it was his duty to return to Athens, left the princess to raise the boy alone. Before departing, he placed his sword and sandals beneath a massive boulder. "Only when the boy is strong enough to lift this stone," he told Aethra, "will he be worthy of travelling to Athens to claim his birthright. These items will be the symbols by which I can recognize my son." The sword and sandals. Theseus grew into a smart and capable young man, and sure enough, when he finally reached manhood, he was strong enough to lift the rock and claim his father's possessions. Bidding his mother farewell, he set out on the long road to Athens, ready to claim his birthright. But when Theseus finally arrived in Athens, he found the palace gates heavily guarded and his father nowhere to be seen. The king, he learned, had married during the years since his visit to Trojan. His new queen was a woman named Medea, a sorceress from the distant kingdom of Colchis at the edge of the world. Medea's history was dark and stained with blood. She had once been a princess in her homeland, where she fell in love with a Greek hero named Jason, who had come seeking a treasure called the Golden Fleece. She used her powerful magic to help him steal it, betraying her own father and even killing her own brother to ensure their escape. Together they fled to Greece, where Jason married her and she bore him 2 sons. But Jason's love did not last. When he abandoned Medea for a younger princess, the sorceress took terrible revenge. She murdered Jason's new bride with a poisoned gown and killed her own children to punish their father. With all of Greece hunting her for these crimes, she fled to Athens, where she used her magic and beauty to enchant King Aegeus into marriage. She had since borne him a son named Midas, who was now heir to the throne. When Medea learned that Theseus had arrived claiming to be Aegeus's legitimate son, she saw him as a threat to everything she had built. She had killed to protect herself before, and she would do no less to secure the throne for her son. When Theseus requested an audience with the king, Medea quickly intercepted him. "My husband sees many young men who claim to be his long-lost son," she said with false sweetness. "If you wish to prove yourself worthy of an audience, you must first demonstrate your strength. There is a mad bull terrorizing the countryside near Marathon, killing farmers and destroying crops. Slay this beast, and the king will receive you." She sent him to face the bull of Marathon, hoping he would never return. But Theseus, drawing on his divine strength and speed, managed to slay the creature after a fierce battle. When he returned to Athens with proof of his victory, Medea realized a more direct approach was needed. As Theseus finally stood before King Aegeus in the throne room, Medea herself brought forward a cup of wine to welcome him. "Drink," she said with a smile. "You must be thirsty after your victory." Theseus accepted the cup and raised it to his lips, but just as he was about to drink, Aegeus leaned forward in his throne, his eyes fixed on something at Theseus's side. That sword, the king said, his voice trembling. Where did you get that sword? Theseus lowered the cup, surprised by the question. It was left for me by my father, along with these sandals. They were hidden beneath a great stone in Trojan. Aegeus finished the sentence, leapt from the throne in excitement. Rushing forward, he went to embrace his son, knocking the cup from Theseus's hand as he did so. The wine spilled across the marble floor, and where it touched the stone, it began to hiss and bubble, eating into the marble like acid. The room fell silent as everyone stared at the corroding stone. Aegeus turned slowly to Medea. "You tried to poison him," he cried accusingly. "You tried to murder my son." "Your son?" Medea's face went pale as she realized her mistake. She had not known about the sword and sandals, had not known this young man truly was Aegeus's heir. "Leave Athens," Aegeus commanded. "Leave now before I have you executed." Medea fled that very night, her plans destroyed once again. She would return to Colchis, back to the edge of the world, having finally exhausted Greece's tolerance for her crimes. Aegeus embraced Theseus, tears streaming down his face. "My son, I thought I would never see this day." He declared Theseus his heir before all the court, and, for a time, Athens rejoiced. The tributes. But Theseus soon learned that Athens lived under a terrible shadow. His father told him the story with shame in his voice. "Many years ago," Aegeus explained, "Athens went to war with King Minos of Crete. We were defeated utterly, our army destroyed. Minos could have razed our city to the ground, enslaved our people. Instead, he offered us terms." The king's voice grew heavy. "Every 9 years, we must send him a tribute. 7 young men and 7 young women. They are taken to Crete and fed to a monster that lives beneath his palace." "What kind of monster?" Theseus asked. "They call it the Minotaur," Aegeus said. "It is said to be half man, half bull, the offspring of Minos' wife, Pasiphae, and a sacred bull sent by Poseidon. The creature is kept in an impossible labyrinth designed by the master craftsman Daedalus. No one who enters has ever found their way out. The tributes wander until they encounter the Minotaur, or until they starve to death, lost in the endless passages." "How many tributes have been sent?" Theseus asked quietly. "This will be the 3rd, his father replied. 28 of Athens' children have already been devoured. In a few weeks, 14 more will be chosen by lot and shipped to Crete." Theseus felt rage building in his chest. "No," he said, "not any more. I will go as one of the tributes. I will kill this Minotaur and end this horror." Aegeus seized his son's arm. "You cannot. I have only just found you. If you go to Crete, you will die like all the others." "I am not like the others," Theseus said, his voice firm. "I lifted the stone you said no ordinary man could move. I killed the bull of Marathon with my bare hands. I was born for challenges like this." They argued through the night, but Aegeus could not change his son's mind. Finally, with tears in his eyes, the king gave his blessing. "If you must go, then take this one comfort with you." He gestured to the ship being prepared in the harbour. "That vessel sails with black sails, as it has for the previous tributes, a symbol of mourning, but I will give you white sails as well. If you succeed, if you somehow slay the Minotaur and survive, change the black sails to white before you return. That way, when I watch for your ship from the cliffs, I will know from afar that you live." Theseus embraced his father. "I will return with white sails flying, I swear it." And so, as the 14 tributes were chosen and boarded the black-sailed ship, Theseus stood among them. The other young Athenians wept, knowing they sailed toward their deaths. But Theseus stood at the prow, his face set with determination, watching as Crete drew closer on the horizon. The Minotaur. When the black-sailed ship arrived at the harbour of Knossos, the 14 Athenian tributes were led through the streets to the palace. Crowds gathered to watch them pass, some jeering, others looking away in pity. These young men and women were already dead. Everyone knew that no one escaped the labyrinth. In the palace throne room, King Minos sat waiting, a cruel smile on his face. He was an old man now, but his gaze was sharp and cold. This was a ceremony Minos enjoyed, looking upon the tributes Athens sent him, a reminder of his power over their city. "Welcome to Crete," Minos said, his voice deep. "I trust your journey was pleasant. Tomorrow at dawn you will be sent into the labyrinth to meet my beloved Minotaur. I suggest you make peace with whatever gods you worship." The Athenian tributes stood in terror, but Theseus met Minos' gaze without flinching. "I am Theseus, son of King Aegeus and heir to Athens," he said clearly. "I have come not as a sacrifice, but as a warrior. Your monster will die tomorrow." Minos laughed. "Oh, delightful! They usually weep and beg. This will make the entertainment all the more enjoyable." He waved his hand dismissively. "Take them to their chambers. Let them have one last comfortable night." As the guards led the tributes away, the king's daughter Ariadne found she could not take her eyes off the young man who had spoken so boldly to her father. There was something about him, his courage, his determination, that stirred something in her heart. That evening she could not stop thinking about him. She knew what awaited him in the labyrinth. She had seen countless tributes enter over the years, hearing their screams as the monster devoured them. The thought of this brave young man wandering, lost in the darkness, eventually meeting the Minotaur's horns, filled her with unexpected anguish. She made her decision. That night, as the palace slept, Ariadne made her way to the chambers where the tributes were being held. She found Theseus sitting alone, sharpening his sword by lamplight, while his companions slept uneasily around him. "You should not be here, Princess," Theseus said quietly, looking up as she entered. "No, I should not," Ariadne agreed, stepping closer. "But I cannot stand by and watch you die. You're either very brave or very foolish to think you can defeat the Minotaur." "Perhaps both," Theseus said with a slight smile, "but I meant what I said. I will kill this creature, or die trying." Ariadne knelt beside him, her voice urgent. "The true threat you face is not the Minotaur, it is the labyrinth itself." She pressed a ball of golden thread into his hands. "The maze is so vast and complex that all who enter become hopelessly lost. Most starve to death before ever encountering the beast. Take this thread, tie it at the entrance, and unwind it as you go. When you have finished, follow it back to freedom." "Why help me?" Theseus asked. "Because I cannot bear to see you die," Ariadne said, tears forming in her eyes, "and because I am also trapped here. My father rules with an iron fist, and I'm sick of being the daughter of a man who delights in such cruelty. If you truly can kill the Minotaur, then all I ask is that you take me with you." She paused, as if summoning the courage for what she was about to say. "But I cannot come as a refugee to your city. I ask that you take me as your wife. I know it is bold, but I have royal blood. I would not shame you, and She hesitated. "I believe we could be happy together." Theseus looked at her for a long moment. The offer was generous, A Cretan princess as his bride would strengthen his claim to the throne, and there was something about her courage, her willingness to betray her own father for what was right, that moved him. "When I kill the Minotaur," he said, "you will come with me to Athens as my wife. This I swear." He entered the labyrinth at dawn, tying the thread securely at the entrance before beginning his descent into darkness. The passages twisted and turned, branching off in every direction, the air growing thick and stale the deeper he went. For hours Theseus walked through the winding paths, the thread unwinding behind him like a lifeline connecting him to the world above. Several times he came to intersections where 5 or 6 passages met, each one looking identical to the others. Without Ariadne's thread, he would have been lost within minutes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity in the darkness, the passage opened into a vast chamber at the labyrinth's heart. And there, in the center of that space, the Minotaur waited. The creature was massive, far larger than Theseus had imagined. It had the body of a man, but scaled up to monstrous proportions, every muscle defined and powerful. But where a human head should have been, there was instead the head of a great bull, with curved horns as sharp as any spear. When it saw Theseus enter, it bellowed, a painful sound that was neither fully human nor fully beast, and then it began to charge. Theseus barely had time to draw his sword before the creature was upon him. He dove aside at the last moment, rolling across the stone floor as the Minotaur's horns passed inches from his body. The creature wheeled around with surprising speed for something so large, already preparing another charge. For what felt like hours they fought in that dark chamber. The Minotaur was stronger, but Theseus was faster, Poseidon's gift of divine agility allowing him to dodge blows that would have crushed any normal man. He darted in and out, striking where he could, slowly wearing the creature down. But Theseus was tiring too. His arms burned with exhaustion, and he had taken several glancing blows that left him bruised and bleeding. The Minotaur seemed inexhaustible, its rage only growing with each wound. Then the creature made a mistake. It charged again, head lowered, horns aimed at Theseus's chest, but instead of dodging aside, Theseus dropped to his knees and thrust his sword upward with both hands. The blade caught the Minotaur in the throat, driving deep. The creature's momentum carried it forward, impaling itself further on the blade. It staggered, blood pouring from the wound, and crashed to its knees. Theseus pulled his sword free and struck again, this time severing the great arteries in the beast's neck. The Minotaur collapsed onto the stone floor, its massive body shuddering once before going still. Theseus stood triumphant. Never again would Athens have to sacrifice its children to this monster. He found the thread where it had fallen during the fight and began following it back through the twisting passages. After hours of walking, he finally emerged into daylight to find Ariadne and the 13 other Athenian tributes waiting anxiously at the entrance. When they saw him alive, covered in blood but victorious, they erupted in cheers. That night, under cover of darkness, they escaped the island in their ship and began the voyage back to Athens. The fate of Ariadne. The voyage back to Athens should have been triumphant. The other Athenians sang songs of victory, laughing and celebrating their escape. Theseus joined them at first, but any time Ariadne approached, he grew cold and distant, staring off into the horizon. Ariadne watched him with growing unease. She had given up everything for him, her family, her home, her entire life. In those first hours after their escape, when Theseus had looked at her with gratitude and something that might have been love, she had believed it was worth it. But now, as Athens drew closer, she saw the way he looked at her changing. His smiles became forced. He made excuses to avoid her. She told herself she was imagining it, but deep down she knew the truth. He was regretting his promise. When they stopped at the island of Naxos to resupply, Ariadne felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps some time alone together, away from the others, would remind him of what they had shared. That evening they walked along the beach together, in silence. Theseus seemed troubled, but when she reached for his hand, he did not pull away. "Tomorrow we reach Athens," she said softly. "I know your people may not welcome a Cretan princess at first, but I will prove myself to them." "You should rest," Theseus interrupted gently. "It has been a long journey. Tomorrow will be a difficult day." She wanted to talk further, but she had barely slept since leaving Crete, exhaustion weighing down upon her. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps things would seem clearer in the morning. She lay down on the soft sand, and, despite her anxiety, sleep took her quickly. When Ariadne woke, the sun was high in the sky. She sat up, disoriented, calling for Theseus. Only silence answered her. She ran to where the ship had been anchored and found nothing but empty water. No ship, no Theseus, no other Athenians. They had left while she slept, sailing away without a word. For a moment, Ariadne simply stood there, unable to comprehend what had happened. Then the full weight of it crashed down. Theseus had abandoned her. After everything she had sacrificed, he had waited until she was asleep and left her to die alone on this deserted island. She wept until she had no tears left. Days passed in a blur of despair. She searched the island for food and water, but found little. She built fires on the beach, hoping a passing ship might see the smoke. But none came. She was going to die there, alone, forgotten by the man she had given up everything for. It was then that Dionysus found her. The god of wine and revelry had been travelling through the islands when he saw the smoke from her fire. He found her on the beach, half-starved and delirious, calling out Theseus's name in her fevered dreams. When he heard her story, divine rage filled him. "He left you here to die after you gave him everything?" Dionysus asked, his voice cold with fury. "I was a fool," Ariadne whispered. "I thought he loved me. I thought I mattered to him." "You matter," Dionysus said, kneeling beside her. "Theseus is a fool who threw away something precious because he was too blind to see its value. But I see it. Come with me." He brought her to Olympus, where he took her as his wife. Zeus himself placed a crown of stars upon her head, making her a goddess, the constellation Corona Borealis, forever shining in the night sky. She was given the immortality and honor that Theseus had denied her, becoming a goddess while he remained bound to the earth, destined to grow old and die like any other man. The return to Athens. King Aegeus spent every day after his son's departure standing on the cliffs overlooking the harbour. From dawn until the sun sank below the horizon, he would watch the sea, searching for any sign of a returning ship. The other Athenians whispered that the king was going mad with grief, that he should accept his son was dead like all the others who had entered the labyrinth. But Aegeus refused to abandon hope. "He promised me white sails," he would tell anyone who tried to convince him to come inside. "If Theseus lives, he will change the sails. I will know the moment I see the ship." On the 15th day, a speck appeared on the horizon. Aegeus's heart leapt. A ship was approaching. He strained his eyes, trying to make out any detail. As the ship grew closer, he could see it was the right size, the right build. It could be them. It could be his son. Aegeus held his breath, willing himself to see white sails catching the wind. But the sails were black. Black as morning. Black as death. Beneath those very sails, Theseus stood at the prow of his ship, watching Athens grow larger on the horizon. His young heart raced with excitement. He had killed the Minotaur and saved his city. He was a hero. Songs would be sung about this day for generations. His thoughts of future glory were interrupted by one of his fellow Athenians. "The city is just ahead," the man said, grinning. "Your father will be so proud. Did you remember to change the sails like he asked?" Theseus felt his heart freeze. The sails! He spun around and looked up at the black canvas billowing above him. Horror flooded through him. In all the excitement of the victory, the escape, and the romance with Ariadne, he had completely forgotten. The white sails his father had given him were still packed below deck, never raised. "No," Theseus whispered. "No, it cannot be." He screamed for the crew to change the sails immediately, but it was too late. They were already entering the harbour. Already he could see people gathering on the shore, pointing at the ship. Their celebration songs died away as they recognized the black sails. And on the cliffs above, Theseus saw a small figure in royal robes standing at the edge. "Father!" Theseus cried, but the wind carried his voice away. "Father! I'm alive!" The figure stepped off the cliff. Theseus watched in horror as his father fell, as the man who had waited 15 days for his son's return plummeted into the sea below. The waters that had carried Theseus home now claimed his father's life, and from that day forward they would be known as the Aegean Sea in King Aegeus's honour. The city of Athens mourned for 7 days. They had sent 14 young people to what should have been their deaths, and miraculously all 14 had returned alive. But they had also lost their king, and the joy of victory was swallowed by grief. When the mourning period ended, the priests declared that Athens needed a new ruler, and Theseus was Aegeus's only heir. The crown fell to him not in triumph, but in sorrow. As they placed the crown upon his head, Theseus thought about the cost of his victory. He had killed the Minotaur, freeing his city from Crete's terrible tribute, but he had also killed his father, abandoned the woman who had saved his life, and earned his throne through carelessness and betrayal. He was a hero now, celebrated throughout Greece, but the weight of his mistakes would never leave him. He had escaped the labyrinth in Crete, but the path he had carved through his own choices, from that, there would be no thread to guide him. Part 7. Icarus. While Theseus sailed home to Athens with Ariadne at his side, King Minos stood in the entrance to his labyrinth, staring into the darkness. The Minotaur was dead, the Athenian tributes had escaped, and his daughter Ariadne had fled with them, betraying her own father. But someone else had betrayed him too. "Bring me Daedalus," Minos commanded. The guards knew better than to hesitate and immediately began their search. Daedalus was the greatest architect and inventor Greece had ever known, able to craft mechanisms of such complexity that they seemed like magic. When Minos had needed a prison for the Minotaur, something inescapable for both the monster and the tributes sent to feed it, he had turned to Daedalus. The master craftsman had designed the labyrinth beneath the palace, a maze of twisting passages and false paths that stretched for miles in every direction. It was his masterpiece, a structure so ingenious that anyone who entered would be lost within minutes. For years, the structure had worked exactly as intended. None who entered ever escaped, That is, until Theseus arrived. When the guards brought Daedalus before him, Minos could barely contain his anger.
"You told me you had built a labyrinth that no one could escape, and yet that Athenian boy defeated it with a ball of string. I've half a mind to execute you here and be done with it."
"My lord," Daedalus pleaded, "the design was flawless, is still flawless. Please, I will find a way to make sure this cannot happen again." But Minos cared little for his excuses.
"Guards," the king said, "take him and his son to the lowest level of the labyrinth. Let the master craftsman see if he can escape his own creation."
They seized the inventor's son from his workshop and dragged them both into the darkness below.
"Do not worry, Icarus,"
Daedalus reassured his son as they walked.
"I will find a way to get us out of here. Just you wait."
Icarus nodded. A boy of 14, he had spent his entire life marvelling at his father's creations and had complete faith that he would somehow get them both out of this. The guards led them deeper and deeper, going further than the tributes had ever gone, past the chamber where the Minotaur had died, and into passages that twisted back on themselves like coiled serpents. Finally, they cut the rope they'd been using to mark their path and left father and son alone in the darkness. For days, Daedalus tried everything. He knew the principles of his design, understood how the passages should connect, but his design was too good, the labyrinth too vast and complex for even its creator to escape. They rationed what little food the guards had left them, drinking water that dripped from the stone walls, with hope beginning to fade. Icarus tried to stay strong, but Daedalus could see the fear growing in his son's eyes. They were going to die down here, trapped in the dark, like the tributes who had come before them. It was Icarus who finally said what they were both thinking. "Father, we're not going to find the way out, are we?" Daedalus sank against a wall, his pride finally breaking. His greatest achievement had become his tomb. Then he looked up at a shaft far above where light filtered down, where birds nested in the high places of the labyrinth. He watched one take flight, disappearing into the brightness far above. "You are right," he said slowly. "We cannot find our way out through the passages, but perhaps we do not need to." He stood, new energy in his voice. "The only way out is up." Over the following days they gathered materials: feathers that had fallen from where birds nested above, wax from the candles that had been left burning in wall sconces. Daedalus worked with desperation, his clever hands weaving frames from the reeds that grew from cracks in the floor and binding feathers with the wax. Icarus watched in wonder as two great wings took shape. "Will they really work?" "They will," Daedalus said, "but you must listen to me, Icarus. These wings are delicate, only held together with wax. If you fly too high, the sun will melt it and the feathers will come loose. If you fly too low, the sea spray will soak the feathers and weigh them down. You must stay close to me. You must fly the middle path. Do you understand?" "I understand, Father," Icarus said eagerly. "Promise me," Daedalus said, his expression grave. "Promise you will be careful." "I promise." When both sets of wings were complete, they strapped them on and stood beneath one of the vertical shafts. Daedalus went first, testing the wings with careful movements, feeling the air catch beneath them. Then, with powerful strokes, he rose up through the shaft, climbing toward the light. Icarus followed, his heart pounding with excitement and fear. They emerged into brilliant sunlight, bursting free from the labyrinth into the open sky above Crete. They were free, finally feeling they could breathe again after days in the damp corridors under the earth. Daedalus turned toward the open sea, and Icarus followed. Side by side they flew, father and son, leaving the island of Crete behind, the Mediterranean stretching out in endless blue beneath them. Icarus had never felt anything like it. the wind rushing past him, the wings responding to his every movement. He was flying, actually flying, like the birds, like the gods. The fear and despair of the labyrinth now seemed like a distant dream.
"Stay close!"
Daedalus called over the wind, but Icarus barely heard him. He was climbing higher, testing the wings, seeing how fast he could rise. The higher he went, the lighter he felt. The sun was warm on his face, welcoming him upward.
"Icarus!"
came a cry from far below.
"Not so high!"
But his father's voice was faint now. The boy laughed with pure joy, climbing toward the sun, feeling invincible, like he could touch the sky itself. That's when he felt something warm dripping onto his arms. He looked down and saw wax melting in the sun's heat. Feathers were starting to come loose and drift away in the wind. "Father!" he called out, his voice suddenly small. More feathers fell away, then more. The wings were collapsing, the wax that held them together now running like water. Icarus beat them frantically, but they no longer caught the air. "Father!" he cried out, but there was no answer. The wings tore apart completely, and Icarus plummeted toward the sea below, his scream lost in the rushing wind. Daedalus turned just in time to see his son hit the water, the splash white against the blue, and then nothing. The master craftsman descended slowly, circling the spot where his son had fallen. He landed on a nearby island and searched the shores, sobbing when he finally found Icarus's body washed up on the rocks. He buried him there on that desolate shore, and the island would ever after be called Icaria, in memory of the boy who had flown too close to the sun. Daedalus would live for many more years, his genius still sought after by kings and heroes, but he never built anything as ambitious as the labyrinth again. The joy had gone from his work. Every mechanism he created, every design he perfected, was a reminder of what his cleverness had cost him. Part 8. The Calydonian Boar Hunt. The first age of heroes was drawing to a close. Cadmus had founded Thebes, Perseus had slain Medusa, and Heracles had completed his labours and ascended to Olympus. But their stories had inspired a new generation, young warriors who had grown up hearing tales of the Nemean lion and the Minotaur, eager to forge their own legends. They would soon have their chance. Word spread across every town and city of a beast terrorizing the great kingdom of Calydon, and the call went out for heroes to gather for what would become the greatest hunt Greece had ever seen. Calydon itself lay on the western edge of Greece, ruled by King Aeneas and his wife Queen Althea. When their son was born, they named him Meleager and celebrated with feasts that lasted 7 days. But unknown to King Aeneas, the child was not truly his. Meleager was the son of Ares, god of war, who had visited Althea in secret. The affair drew the attention of the 3 Fates, the ancient goddesses who weave the destiny of every mortal. They appeared at the moment of Meleager's birth, entering the bedchamber where the infant lay wrapped in cloth near a freshly lit fire. The eldest Fate pointed to a large log burning among the flames and spoke. "Child of fire and war's red hand, your life burns bright across the land. This wood and you are bound as one. When it turns to ash, your life is done." The 3 sisters departed as suddenly as they had come, leaving their prophecy hanging in the air. Queen Althea, who had been recovering in the next room, heard everything. She rushed to the fire and pulled the burning log from the flames, dousing it with water before it could be consumed. This single piece of wood, charred but intact, now controlled the life of her son. As long as it remained unburned, he would continue to live. She carried it to the palace treasury and locked it in a chest where it would remain safe from fire, thieves, or any who might wish to harm him. Nearly 20 years passed. Meleager grew into a strong and capable warrior, being one of the heroes chosen to join Jason and the Argonauts on their legendary quest for the Golden Fleece. Yet, when he returned to Calydon, expecting to be celebrated as a hero, he instead found his homeland in ruins. His father, King Aeneas, had been blessed by Dionysus with a particularly fruitful harvest the previous year. The fields had overflowed with grain, and the vineyards burst with grapes. Caught up in the celebrations that had erupted across the kingdom, Aeneas had remembered to make offerings to all the gods in thanks, all except for one. The altar of Artemis, goddess of the hunt, remained empty, and she was not one to forgive such insults. She sent a beast to punish Calydon, a boar unlike any seen before. It was enormous, far larger than a bull, with tusks that could tear a man in two. It was the type of creature Heracles had faced during his labours, but with the great hero no longer around, King Aeneas needed others to take up the call before his entire kingdom was trampled beneath the boar's hooves. The king sent messengers across Greece with a desperate plea: "Come to Calydon and help slay the beast." To whoever struck the killing blow, he offered both glory and the boar's hide as a prize. The call was answered. Jason came with several of his Argonauts. Theseus arrived from Athens. Nestor of Pylos brought his wisdom. In all, over 50 warriors gathered in Calydon, and among them was Prince Meleager, who was chosen to lead the hunt. But on the morning they were to depart, one final hunter arrived. She rode into the courtyard alone, a bow slung across her back, a quiver at her hip. The gathered warriors fell silent, then burst into laughter. "A woman!" one man called out. "Has Calydon grown so desperate we're recruiting kitchen maids?" "Perhaps she's lost," another jeered. "The market is in the other direction, dear." The woman dismounted and faced them without flinching. "My name is Atalanta, and I have come for the boar." This provoked a fresh round of laughter. Men blew kisses and made exaggerated bows. "Go home, girl," someone called out. "This is work for men." But Atalanta was not like other women. She had been born to a king who wanted a son and, disappointed by her daughter, had ordered her exposed on a mountainside to die. Yet a she-bear had found the infant and nursed her until hunters had come by. Raising her as one of their own, the hunters taught her to track and shoot and survive in the wild. By the time she reached adulthood, Atalanta was one of the finest archers in Greece and a devoted follower of Artemis. But the men of Calydon saw nothing of this, only a woman dressed in men's clothing pretending to hunt. Only Meleager did not laugh. He studied her, seeing the way she handled her bow, noticing the calluses on her hands. These were the marks of a true hunter. "She hunts," Meleager said, his voice cutting through the mockery. "You cannot be serious," one man protested. "I am leading this hunt," Meleager said firmly. "She comes with us. Any who object can stay behind." The muttering continued, but no one was willing to miss the hunt. Atalanta met Meleager's eyes and nodded once in acknowledgement. He had seen what the others missed, not a woman pretending to hunt, but a hunter who happened to be a woman. The hunting party set out at dawn. They had no trouble tracking the boar, as it left an unmistakable trail of destruction through the forest. Uprooted trees, churned earth, and the occasional corpse of a farmer who had wandered too close. They eventually found it in a clearing, rooting through the remains of what had once been a small village. Up close, the beast was even more terrifying than the stories suggested. It stood taller than a horse, its scarred hide and bloodied tusks a testament to the many battles it had already won. When it caught their scent, it raised its massive head and fixed them with a pair of burning red eyes that marked it out as a child of the gods. "Surround it," Meleager commanded. "Drive it towards the center." The hunters spread out, forming a loose circle. They began closing in, spears raised, shouting to keep the beast's attention divided. For a moment, the plan seemed to be working. Then the boar charged. It dove forward with unnatural speed. One hunter tried to dodge aside, but moved too slowly, the boar's tusk catching him in the ribs, lifting him off his feet and tossing him through the air. He hit the ground and did not rise again. Panic rippled through the circle. Men rushed in from all sides, desperate to strike before it killed again. A hunter threw his javelin, but his aim went wide, the spear sailing past the boar and striking another hunter in the chest. As the wounded man fell, screaming, the hunt descended into chaos. Men shouted and ran as the boar trampled warriors underfoot, many falling over each other in a desperate attempt to escape. Amid the panic, only one figure remained calm. Atalanta had climbed a fallen tree to get a better angle. While the others fled screaming, she drew her bow with the steady hands of a seasoned hunter. She waited for the right moment, tracking the beast as it wheeled and charged. When it paused to gore another victim, she released. The arrow struck the boar in the side of its neck, just below the jaw. Blood burst from the wound, and the beast squealed, thrashing wildly as pain overwhelmed it. "Now!" Meleager shouted. He charged forward with his spear while the creature was distracted, driving the point deep into its side, aiming for the heart. The boar staggered, legs buckling as its lifeblood poured out. After a final cry, it collapsed to the ground, joining the bodies of its many victims. A ragged cheer went up from the surviving hunters. Men embraced, laughing with relief and shock. Several warriors clapped Meleager on the back, praising his courage and skill. "The killing blow was yours," one man declared. "The hide is yours by right." But Meleager shook his head. He walked to where Atalanta was descending from the tree. "The hide belongs to her," he said loudly enough for all to hear. "She struck first. She drew blood. By the laws of the hunt, the prize is hers." Silence fell over the group. "You cannot be serious," a voice said. It was Plexippus, one of Meleager's uncles. He and his brother, Toxius, stepped forward, their faces dark with anger. "A woman cannot claim such a prize. It is an insult to every man here." "She earned it," Meleager said. "If you do not want the hide, fine," Toxius said. "But it should go to us, your family, not to some girl who got lucky with one arrow." "She saved half of us from dying in that chaos," Meleager snapped. "While you were running in circles, she kept her head and made the shot that mattered." "You're blinded by her pretty face," Plexippus sneered. "Everyone can see it. This is not about honor, it is about you wanting to bed her." Meleager's hand went to his sword. "Take that back." "Make me, nephew." Plexippus reached for the boar's hide, dragging it toward himself. "This belongs to the family." Meleager's sword flew from its sheath and caught Plexippus in the throat. His uncle staggered backward, blood pouring between his fingers as he tried to stem the flow. "Brother!" Toxeus cried as he drew his own blade and lunged at Meleager. The younger man sidestepped and drove his sword through his uncle's chest. Toxeus fell beside his brother. The clearing was silent, except for the sound of dying men choking on their own blood. When Meleager looked up from the bodies, he saw the other hunters staring back at him in horror. Even Atalanta stood frozen, her face pale. Word travelled fast. Long before the hunting party returned to Calydon, messengers had already reached the city with news of the deaths. Queen Althea was in the palace courtyard when she heard that her two brothers had been killed by her own son. Plexippus and Toxeus had practically raised her, being both family and her closest friends in this world. She could not bear to think of a world without them, still less a world in which they had been murdered by her son. Without a word, she left the courtyard and went to her private chambers. From beneath the floorboards she retrieved a chest she had hidden there 20 years ago, unlocking it with a key that always hung round her neck. Inside lay the log that controlled her son's life, still charred and ashen from its brief time in the fire all those years ago. Althea carried it to the great hall, where a fire burned in the central hearth. She stood before the fire and looked down at the log one last time. She could only think of her brothers, Plexippus with his booming laugh, Toxeus, who had taught her to ride when she was young, both dead now, cut down by her own son over a woman he barely knew. With tears streaming down her face, Althea threw the log into the flames. Miles away, Meleager was walking back toward Calydon when a pain struck him, unlike any he had ever known. He gasped and fell to his knees, clutching his chest. It felt like fire was consuming him from the inside, burning through his lungs, his heart, his very bones. "Meleager!" Atalanta rushed to his side, but there was nothing she could do. He thrashed on the ground, screaming, as the log in his mother's fire was consumed by flames. When the wood crumbled to ash, Meleager's screams cut off abruptly. He went still, eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. Back in Calydon, Althea watched the last piece of log blacken and disintegrate. The moment it turned to ash, the enormity of what she had done became clear. She had killed her own son. The servants found her body in her chambers that evening. She had taken her own life, unable to bear what she had done. The greatest hunt Greece had ever known had ended with a dead monster, 2 murdered uncles, a son burned to ash by his mother's hand, and a queen who took her own life in grief. The heroes dispersed quietly, ashamed to speak of what had happened in Calydon. Only Atalanta remained, standing over Meleager's grave long after the others had gone. The foot race. The tragedy at Calydon did not stop Atalanta's name from spreading across Greece. If anything, the disaster made her more famous. The woman who had struck the first blow against the great Boar, the hunter for whom a prince had killed his own uncles. Suitors began arriving wherever she went, nobles and warriors eager to claim her as a wife. But Atalanta had no interest in marriage. She'd grown up wild and free in the forests, answering to no one. The thought of becoming some man's possession, confined to a home and expected to produce heirs, filled her with dread. She came up with a simple solution to rid herself of unwanted suitors. "I will marry," she announced, "but only the man who can defeat me in a foot race. Anyone who races and loses will be executed." It was a clever test. Atalanta was not just one of the finest archers in Greece, she was also among the fastest runners alive. No ordinary man could hope to match her speed. Yet they came anyway. One by one, suitors arrived at her father's palace, confident in their own abilities, certain they would succeed where others had failed. And one by one, Atalanta left them behind in the dust, crossing the finish line while they were still struggling far behind. Each was executed as promised, their bodies a warning to those who came next. Still, the suitors kept coming, and among the crowds who gathered to watch each doomed race stood a young man named Hippomenes. He had attended every contest, not to compete, but simply to watch Atalanta run. He had fallen in love with the huntress from the first moment he saw her, despite knowing what happened to those who challenged her. But Hippomenes was young and untrained, with no exceptional speed or strength. He knew he could not defeat her through his own abilities alone. Yet love, as it so often does, drove him to madness. He announced that he would race Atalanta, ignoring the warnings of his friends and the laughter of the crowd. Everyone knew how this would end. The night before the race, Hippomenes went to a temple of Aphrodite. He knelt before her altar and prayed desperately for help, offering everything he had if only the goddess would grant him the means to win. When he finished his prayer, the temple grew warm, and the scent of roses filled the air. Aphrodite appeared before him, radiant and amused. "Why should I help you?" she asked, studying him with interest. "So many men have died racing this girl. What makes you different?" "Because she deserves to be loved," Hippomenes said, "and because I will love her as no one else can." Aphrodite looked into the distance for a moment, then smiled. She reached into the folds of her robe and produced 3 golden apples, each one gleaming with an otherworldly light. "These are from the garden of the Hesperides," she said. "No mortal can resist their beauty. Use them wisely." The next morning the race began. Atalanta took the lead immediately, pulling ahead with long, powerful strides, while Hippomenes struggled to keep pace behind her. When she was several lengths ahead, Hippomenes pulled the first apple from his belt and threw it onto the track in front of her. The moment it left his hand, it seemed to glow even brighter in the sunlight. Atalanta's eyes locked onto it, and she stopped running. She could not help herself. The apple was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and almost against her will, she bent down and picked it up, turning it over in her hands. Then she remembered the race. She tucked the apple into her belt and began running again, but Hippomenes had closed the distance. Near the halfway point, he threw the second apple. Once more, Atalanta could not help herself. Despite knowing what had happened before, despite understanding the trick, she stopped and picked it up. As they approached the finish line, Atalanta was ahead once more, her lead seemingly insurmountable. Hippomenes' lungs burned and his legs ached, but he reached for the third and final apple. This time, instead of throwing it directly in front of her, he hurled it far to the side of the track, into the grass beyond. Atalanta saw the golden gleam arcing through the air. She knew she should ignore it, but the compulsion was too strong. She veered sharply off course, chasing the apple as it bounced and rolled across the ground. Behind her, Hippomenes summoned the last of his strength and staggered across the finish line. His legs gave out the moment he crossed it, and he collapsed to his knees, chest heaving. He had won. Atalanta stood at the edge of the track, holding the third golden apple in her hands, and looked back at the finish line. For a moment, no one was certain what she would do. Then she began to laugh. Not bitterly, but with genuine amusement. She walked over to where Hippomenes still knelt, struggling to catch his breath. "That was clever," she said, looking down at him. "Very clever indeed." Hippomenes looked up at her, uncertain whether to accept fury or acceptance. You didn't try to beat me with strength or speed, Atalanta continued. You used your mind instead, and you risked your life for it. She extended her hand to help him up. I can respect that. They were married within the month. To Atalanta's surprise, she found herself genuinely happy. Hippomenes was kind and thoughtful, quick with words and gentle in manner. More importantly, he treated her as an equal, rather than a prize he had won. He never tried to control her or diminish her abilities. When she wanted to hunt, he encouraged her. When she spoke, he listened. They had a son together, and for a time her life was everything she had never thought she wanted. Peaceful, content, complete. But Hippomenes, in his excitement over winning the race and claiming his bride, had forgotten one crucial thing. He never returned to Aphrodite's temple to offer thanks for the golden apples. The goddess who had granted him his heart's desire received no gratitude in return, and Aphrodite, just like Artemis, did not forget insults. One afternoon, as Hippomenes and Atalanta journeyed through a remote valley, they came upon an ancient temple of Zeus. They stepped inside, seeking shelter from the heat, but the moment they crossed the threshold, something changed. Hippomenes felt desire surge through him, not natural lust, but something planted in his mind by Aphrodite's vengeful hand. He turned to Atalanta, and she looked back at him with the same sudden, overwhelming hunger. Neither questioned it, neither could resist it. There, beneath the towering statue of Zeus, on the floor of his most sacred space, they made love, blind to everything except each other and oblivious to the sacrilege they were committing. Their fate was sealed that very moment. When they tried to leave the temple, they found they could no longer move. Their bodies began to change, hands curving into paws, skin sprouting golden fur, faces elongating into muzzles. Their voices became roars of terror and confusion. Within moments, 2 lions stood where Atalanta and Hippomenes had been. Zeus's punishment was complete, though it was crueler than a simple transformation. The Greeks believed that lions could not mate with lionesses, that the great cats could only breed with leopards, producing sterile offspring that would leave no legacy. Whether this was true or merely myth did not matter. What mattered was that Atalanta and Hippomenes would remain together, side by side for the rest of their lives, able to hunt as a pair, but unable to share the joys of intimacy ever again. The passion that had led to their downfall would torment them forever. Atalanta had fought her whole life to remain free and wild. In the end, she got her wish, though not in the way she had ever imagined. Part 9. The Trojan War. The first heroes had fought monsters. Cadmus slew his dragon, Perseus beheaded Medusa, Heracles completed 12 impossible labours. The next generation faced different challenges. Theseus descended into the labyrinth to face the Minotaur, and Meleager hunted the Calydonian Boar to save his kingdom. But the final great trial of the heroic age would not be against monsters or beasts. It would be men against men, Greek against Trojan, in a war that would last 10 years and end with an entire city reduced to ash. This is the story of how the Age of Heroes died at Troy. Troy was one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world, a city where trade flourished and the gods were always honoured. King Priam and Queen Hecuba had filled the palace with children, 50 sons and 50 daughters, the sounds of laughter always present down its painted corridors. But not all of Priam's children were welcomed with joy. Before Paris was born, Queen Hecuba woke one night screaming. She had dreamt that she would give birth to a flaming torch that consumed all of Troy. Upon reading the omens, the royal seers confirmed her worst fears. The child she carried was cursed, destined to bring destruction upon the city. When the baby was born, Hecuba handed him to a shepherd with instructions to leave him on Mount Ida, where the cold and wolves would claim him. But the shepherd could not bring himself to do it. Instead, he raised Paris as his own son, keeping his royal origins hidden. The torch from Hecuba's dream had not been extinguished. It had only been hidden, waiting for the wind to carry its flames back to Troy. The Oath of Tyndareus. While Paris grew up as a shepherd far across the Aegean Sea, another child was being born, the one who would seal Troy's fate. In Sparta, Queen Leda gave birth to a daughter named Helen. Her father was Zeus himself, and she had inherited a divine beauty that surpassed all others on earth. By the time she reached womanhood, men would stop mid-sentence when she entered a room, with suitors arriving from every corner of Greece to win her hand. Yet King Tyndareus, Helen's mortal father, watched these suitors with growing dread. These were the most powerful men in Greece, each with armies at their command. Any decision would upset all but one of them and would likely end in bloodshed. It was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, who proposed a solution. Make every suitor swear a sacred oath to protect Helen's chosen husband. They swore what would become known as the Oath of Tyndareus, promising to defend him with their lives. With bloodshed averted, Helen chose to wed Prince Menelaus of Mycenae, and the two became the king and queen of Sparta. The disappointed suitors departed peacefully, believing the matter settled, the oath merely a formality that would never be called upon. Little did they know, it would become the catalyst for the greatest war the world had ever known. The Judgment of Paris. High on Mount Olympus, another wedding was taking place, the marriage of the sea nymph Thetis to the mortal king Peleus. Every god had been invited to the magnificent celebrations, all except for one, Eris, the goddess of discord and strife, who was universally despised. From her dark dwelling at the edge of the world, Eris heard of the celebrations and felt the sting of humiliation. This insult would not go unanswered. As the feast reached its height, Eris materialized in the hall and threw a golden apple to the ground. Upon its surface was inscribed a simple phrase, "To the most beautiful." 3 goddesses moved toward it simultaneously. Hera, queen of Olympus, Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Each goddess reached for the apple, then pulled back as the others approached. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop as 3 pairs of immortal eyes met, each certain the prize belonged to her alone. The 3 began to argue, their voices growing louder, their words sharper, with the other guests backing away from what threatened to become a major dispute. Finally, unable to reach any agreement, the 3 goddesses turned to Zeus to make the decision. But Zeus wanted absolutely no part in this decision. To choose any one of them would make eternal enemies of the other 2, making his life miserable for centuries to come. There was simply no winning. "The decision requires a judge with no stake in the outcome," Zeus said before all of Olympus, quickly casting his divine sight across the earth. "There," he declared, "a shepherd on Mount Ida. His name is Paris. He shall be our judge." Within moments, the 3 goddesses appeared before Paris in a blaze of divine light, each promising great rewards in exchange for his vote. Hera promised power of kingdoms stretching from Europe to Asia. Athena offered unrivaled skill in war, glory that would echo through the ages. But Aphrodite studied the loneliness in the young shepherd's heart and whispered something different. "I will give you the most beautiful woman in the world as your wife, a love that will surpass all others. Power meant nothing to a man who had lived simply. Glory meant nothing to one who had never held a sword, but love was something he understood. With trembling hands, Paris gave the golden apple to Aphrodite. Hera and Athena vanished in silence, their dark expressions promising retribution. Aphrodite touched his cheek. "You are no shepherd, Paris of Troy. You are a prince, and it is time you claimed your birthright. Return to your father's city, then sail to Sparta. Your destiny awaits." The abduction of Helen. Within days, Paris stood before Troy's gates, claiming to be Priam's lost son. Hecuba looked at his face and saw the infant she had given away, welcoming him back into the royal family with feasting and celebration, the prophecy of the torch all but forgotten. Paris soon sailed to Sparta, as Aphrodite had instructed, where King Menelaus welcomed him with the hospitality Greek custom demanded. A great feast was prepared, and it was at that first dinner that Paris first laid eyes upon Helen. The breath was stolen from his lungs as he stared at her, her beauty more radiant than he had imagined possible. Their gazes met across the hall, and Aphrodite's magic took hold. A flush rose to Helen's cheeks, and throughout the feast she found herself unable to look away. Over the coming days the attraction grew stronger and stronger until it was almost unbearable. Finally, on the 9th day, as Menelaus departed Sparta to attend his father's funeral, Paris made his move. Slipping into Helen's bedchamber that evening, he found the queen waiting for him. "We could leave tonight," he said softly. "My ships are ready. By dawn we could be beyond pursuit." Helen hesitated for a moment, thinking of her life in Sparta, of the husband who had trusted his guest. Then she looked at Paris and felt Aphrodite's pull like a current she could not fight. She took his outstretched hand. Within minutes they were on the beach, Spartan arrows raining down around them as they climbed onto Paris's ship. As they disappeared beyond the horizon, a Spartan messenger was already riding hard in the other direction, carrying news that would change the course of history. Within days, Menelaus had sent messages across Greece invoking the oath of Tyndareus. Every man who had once sought Helen's hand as a suitor was now oath-bound to come to his aid, bringing with them ships, armies, and a thirst for glory that quickly surpassed the need to reclaim another man's wife. In all, 1,000 ships crossed the Aegean, carrying the greatest army Greece had ever assembled toward the walls of Troy. Achilles. The war that followed would be defined by one man above all others. His name was Achilles, and he was the greatest warrior who had ever lived. He was the son of Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, the couple whose wedding had been disrupted by Eris's golden apple. From his mother, Achilles had inherited near invulnerability, for she had dipped him in the river Styx as an infant, making his body impervious to mortal weapons. Only his heel, where she had gripped him during the ritual, remained vulnerable. Yet this gift came with a terrible prophecy. The oracle had told Thetis that her son faced two fates: a long, peaceful life forgotten by history, or a short, glorious one that would end at Troy, where his name would be sung until the world's end. For 9 long years, Achilles fought with the Greeks at Troy, choosing the path of glory. His name became feared across the battlefield, the invincible warrior who had cut down hundreds of men without so much as a scratch. But Achilles possessed one flaw that would define his life: his temper. Pride and fury lived in him like twin flames, quick to ignite and impossible to control. When insulted, he would not forgive. When challenged, he would not yield. It was a trait that would shape the course of the Trojan War itself. When Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek forces, dishonored Achilles by stealing a slave he had captured during a recent raid, Achilles simply withdrew from the war entirely, unable to stand such an insult. Without him, the Greek army crumbled. Day after day their lines were pushed back, their greatest warriors cut down, until fighting raged around the ships themselves. The Greek commanders begged Achilles to return to the fight, offering him kingdoms, wives, and vast fortunes if he would only come back to save them. But still he refused, happy to see the world burn around him, if only to punish those who had wronged him. Everything, it seemed, was lost. The Greeks would be slaughtered on those beaches, while their greatest warrior sat idle. But then Patroclus stepped forward. Patroclus was Achilles' closest companion. They had been raised together since childhood, the bond between them deeper than friendship, as unbreakable as any blood tie. Where Achilles was fierce and prideful, Patroclus was gentle and wise. They balanced each other perfectly. And what Patroclus saw now made him doubt his friend for the first time. How could he be so heartless? How could he stand by as friends they had fought with for 9 years were cut down by the dozen? He made a fateful decision. Putting on Achilles' armor, he charged out onto the battlefield. "Achilles!" someone screamed. "Achilles has returned!" Within moments the Trojan army was in flight, men falling over each other at the very sight of who they thought was the invincible warrior. Patroclus should have stopped there. He had saved the ships, and the Greek army would live on to fight another day. But caught up in the rush of battle, he continued to charge forward, driving the Trojans toward their walls, becoming increasingly isolated from the rest of the Greek forces. It was there, alone and surrounded, that Hector found him. He was Troy's greatest warrior, a man only surpassed in strength and skill by the real Achilles. And when he saw a Greek warrior standing there in that famous armor, he struck without hesitation, driving a spear through Patroclus's back. If Achilles' rage had been ungovernable after Agamemnon's insult, it was fully unleashed. After hearing of his friend's death, he exploded onto the battlefield like a god in human form. His spear found throats before men could raise their shields. His sword opened bodies from neck to groin. Men fell before him in dozens and then hundreds. When he finally found Hector standing beneath Troy's walls, he was utterly without mercy. He cut down Troy's greatest defender while his family watched from the battlefields above, and then did something that made even his own allies uncomfortable. He took strips of leather and tied them around Hector's ankles. Then he attached the other ends to his chariot and climbed aboard. He whipped his horses into motion. The chariot jerked forward, and Hector's body began to drag behind it, bouncing and tumbling across the rocky ground. Achilles drove around the walls of Troy slowly so that everyone could see what he had done. The Trojans, the Greeks, everyone watched in horror. This was beyond the normal brutality of war. In the weeks that followed, the Trojans began to lose hope. Without Hector to lead them, there was no chance of holding back the invincible warrior. He cut through their lines day after day until they could do nothing but hide behind their walls and wait for the end. But when Achilles approached those walls, preparing to scale them and end the war for good, something remarkable happened. As he went to climb, he felt a sharp pain in his heel. He looked down and saw an arrow had struck him, a strange numbness spreading up his leg. Apollo, who had always loved Hector, had decided to take revenge. Descending to the battlefield, he had guided the hand of Paris, directing him to shoot the one place that remained mortal on an otherwise immortal body. Achilles fell to his knees. the coldness spreading rapidly, climbing through his body like ice in his veins. He tried to laugh, but could not draw breath. After everything, he had been killed by Paris, the cowardly prince. He fell to the ground. Achilles, the greatest warrior Greece had ever known, was dead. The wooden horse. With Achilles dead, the Greeks faced a terrible truth. They could not take Troy by force. Many gave up hope, threatening to abandon the war entirely and sail home. But there was one man who refused to admit defeat. Odysseus, cleverest of the Greek kings, devised a plan that bordered on madness. He ordered a giant wooden horse, built from the remains of their ships, the inside hollowed out with space for 30 armed men. Meanwhile, the rest of the Greek army were instructed to burn their camp and sail beyond the horizon. When dawn broke and the Trojans saw the horse standing before their gates, they could scarcely believe their eyes. After 10 years, the Greeks were finally gone, having left behind what appeared to be a peace offering. Furious debate began over what they should do with the horse. "We should burn it," said Laocoon, a priest. Picking up a spear, he hurled it at the horse. It struck with a hollow thud. "See, it is hollow! There could be anything inside." But before he could say more, 2 enormous serpents emerged from the sea and crushed Laocoon and his 2 sons, divine beasts that could only have been sent by the gods. The message was clear. The horse must be accepted. The Trojans dragged the horse inside, believing the war to be won. The city celebrated into the night, drunk on wine and relief. After 10 years, they finally had peace. As midnight approached and the city fell silent, the hidden door in the horse's belly swung open. Odysseus emerged first, followed by 29 of Greece's greatest surviving warriors. Killing the guards, they opened Troy's gates from within, lighting a signal fire to call the rest of the fleet to return. The Trojans woke to screams and smoke. Greek soldiers were everywhere, breaking down doors, dragging people from their homes, fire spreading quickly through the wooden buildings. Any who tried to resist were slaughtered. King Priam was cut down before the altar of Zeus, his blood staining the sacred altar. Hector's infant son, Astyanax, was thrown from the city walls, while his wife Andromache was taken into slavery. Entire families were wiped out and priceless treasures stolen as the Greeks unleashed a decade of pent-up rage against the burning city. Through it all moved Menelaus, the man whose wife had been the cause of this very conflict. For 10 years he had imagined what he would do when he found Helen. Some nights he dreamt of reconciliation, others he could think of only vengeance. As he climbed the steps of the royal residence and entered Paris's chambers, he was still not sure what he would choose. He had failed to take his revenge against Paris. The Trojan prince had succumbed to a poisoned arrow just days earlier, but some level of vengeance could still be his. Helen turned when he entered, and Menelaus raised his sword, ready to strike her down. But as he looked at her, something faltered. She did not beg for mercy. She just stood there, waiting. "I am sorry," Helen said, "for leaving you, for the war that followed. I wish I had died in Sparta before any of this happened." "You destroyed everything," Menelaus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know. I was Aphrodite's pawn, but that does not absolve me. Their blood is on my hands as well." Menelaus stood there, sword raised, and felt the rage that had sustained him for 10 years crumble. He had loved her once, despite everything, Some part of him still did. He lowered the sword. "Come home. Come back to Sparta." Helen nodded slowly. She would go, not out of love, but because she had nowhere else to go. By dawn, Troy was gone. The walls still stood, blackened by smoke, but everything within was ash. Bodies lay in the streets. Priam's palace was a smoking shell. 10 years of bloodshed had left both peoples broken. The Greeks had lost their greatest heroes. The Trojans had lost everything. There were no true victors, only survivors carrying scars that would never heal. And so the greatest war of the heroic age came to its end, not with triumph, but with ash and the weight of all that had been destroyed. Part 10. The Odyssey. Of all the Greeks who sailed home from Troy, none would suffer a longer or more punishing journey than Odysseus, king of Ithaca. He had spent 10 years fighting at Troy, his cunning mind devising the wooden horse that had finally brought the city to its knees. Now, with the war over and his 12 ships loaded with Trojan gold, he wanted nothing more than to return to his wife Penelope and the son he had left behind as an infant. The journey should have taken weeks. Instead, it would take 10 years. Setting sail from Troy, Odysseus and his fleet headed south along the Greek coast before turning north toward Ithaca. But as they neared those beloved shores, a great storm erupted from a clear sky, the kind of tempest that only the gods can summon. For 9 days the ships were driven across unknown waters until they found themselves approaching an island shrouded in mist, far from any sea lane they recognized. The Cyclops. The men were starving by the time they found a sheltered bay and dragged their ships ashore. Odysseus spotted smoke rising from a shepherd's camp between the limestone cliffs and selected 12 warriors to investigate, taking several cases of strong wine to trade for supplies. The cave they discovered was enormous. Inside, wheels of cheese the size of a warrior's shield were stacked along the walls, pails of fresh milk stood in neat rows, and joints of smoked meat hung from wooden beams. "Quick!" one of the men urged. "Let us take what we need and return to the ships before the owner returns." But then the ground began to shake. Heavy footsteps approached, each one like a boulder dropping from a cliff. Through the cave mouth came the most terrifying sight any of them had ever witnessed. Polyphemus stood 10 times the height of a normal man, a single bloodshot eye set in the center of his broad forehead. He drove his flock inside, then sealed the entrance with a boulder that 20 men could not have moved, trapping the Greeks within. When the Cyclops noticed the strangers, Odysseus stepped forward. "We are traders, blown off course on our journey from Troy. We come offering wine in exchange for provisions. The laws of hospitality, protected by Zeus himself, demand—" But Polyphemus cared nothing for the laws of hospitality. His massive hands shot out and grabbed 2 of the warriors. They barely had time to scream before the Cyclops crushed them and devoured them whole, armor and all, bronze crunching between his teeth. The remaining Greeks pressed themselves against the cave wall, paralyzed with terror. Momentarily satisfied, Polyphemus lay down among his sheep and slept, his snores rumbling through the cave while the men trembled in the darkness. This became the pattern of their nightmare. Each morning, 2 men for breakfast. Each evening, 2 more for dinner. The cave floor grew sticky with blood, and the boulder remained sealed, only ever opening when Polyphemus let his flock out to graze. Odysseus knew that strength alone could never save them. Even if they killed the Cyclops, they would die of starvation behind that immovable stone. Only cleverness could get them out alive. On the 3rd night, after Polyphemus had consumed 2 more companions, Odysseus approached the giant with a large jar of wine. "Great Polyphemus," he said, his voice steady despite the gore still visible on the Cyclops' chin. "You have feasted on my men, but you have not tasted the finest part of our cargo. This wine is strong enough that we mix 1 part with 20 parts water. Perhaps it would help wash down the taste of your meal." The Cyclops snatched the jar and drank deeply, his single eye widening with pleasure. "More!" he bellowed, and Odysseus obliged, pouring jar after jar of unmixed wine down the giant's throat. "Tell me your name, little man," Polyphemus slurred, already swaying, "so I might thank you properly." Odysseus bowed low, hiding his smile. "My name is Nobody. Nobody is what my mother and father call me." "Well, then, Nobody," the Cyclops laughed. "Here is your thanks. I shall eat you last of all." He found this tremendously funny, laughing until tears ran from his great eye. Then the wine did its work, and the giant collapsed among his sheep, unconscious. Working quickly, Odysseus and his remaining men took a massive olive-wood staff they had found in the cave, sharpened one end, and hardened it in the coals of the fire. At his signal, they drove the burning point deep into the Cyclops' eye. Polyphemus woke with a scream that echoed across the island, with other Cyclopes rushing over to the sealed cave to see what was wrong. "What troubles you, brother?" they called. "Is someone trying to kill you?" "Nobody," came the agonized reply. "Nobody is killing me." "Nobody?" one said, confused. "If nobody is hurting you, then this must be a sickness sent by the gods. Pray to your father for relief." And with that they wandered away, leaving Polyphemus alone in his agony. Odysseus's trick had worked perfectly. That night, Odysseus executed the final part of his plan. He and his men tied themselves to the undersides of the largest rams in the Cyclops' flock. When dawn came, Polyphemus pushed aside the boulder to let his flock out, as always, this time feeling each sheep as it passed to check none of the humans made it past. But he never thought to feel beneath them. One by one, the sheep carried the Greeks to freedom. They should have sailed away in silence, but Odysseus could not resist letting his clever escape go unrecognized. Standing at the stern, he shouted back across the water, "If anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was nobody. It was Odysseus, son of Laertes, hero of Troy." From the shore, Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, raised his hands to the sea and prayed, "Hear me, Father. May Odysseus lose every companion. May he wander the seas for years, lost and alone. And if fate decrees he must reach his home, let him arrive as a broken man to find only sorrow." Far beneath the waves, Poseidon heard. From that point on, the sea itself would become Odysseus's enemy. The journey home that should have taken weeks would stretch to 10 long years, all because Odysseus, in his pride, had to reveal who had truly bested the Cyclops. Poseidon's curse. Odysseus sailed on, but Poseidon's curse clung to him like a shadow, causing misfortune wherever he went. After befriending King Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, he was gifted a leather bag containing every contrary wind that might blow his fleet off course, guaranteeing a safe and speedy journey home. But as he neared Ithaca's shores, so close that he could make out people on the beaches, Poseidon's curse worked its magic. His crew, convinced that the bag contained treasures he was keeping from them, opened it when his back was turned, causing every imprisoned wind to burst forth at once. They were thrown back across the sea so violently that the men could only hold on for dear life, Ithaca disappearing beyond the horizon yet again. They next stopped in a sheltered harbour, hoping to rest and recuperate after their ordeal, but here too disaster would strike. The harbour was the hunting grounds for the Laestrygonians, a race of giant cannibals who descended upon the helpless fleet, smashing ships and eating men who had nowhere to run. When the carnage was over, the fleet had been reduced to just a single ship, Odysseus's, who wept as he fled that terrible place. But Poseidon's curse was not finished. They next stopped on the island of Aeaea, not realizing it was home to a powerful witch by the name of Circe. When half of Odysseus's remaining crew stumbled across her house while scouting the island, they accepted her offer of hospitality without question, never suspecting their very lives were in danger. For Circe had laced their food with a powerful drug. As they continued to eat, their faces elongated into snouts, their hands and feet hardened into hooves. Within minutes, where 22 Greek warriors had sat, there were now 22 pigs, squealing in confusion and terror. They would have stayed as Circe's pets forever, retaining their human minds while trapped in a pig's body had Odysseus not come for them. Gifted a magic herb by the god Hermes that allowed him to resist Circe's enchantments, he approached the witch with his sword drawn and forced her to undo her magic, the first success after leaving the Cyclops island. Won over by his heroics, Circe decided to warn Odysseus of the dangers that were to come. Finally, some good fortune. Finally, he had some way to defend against the curse that had been placed on him. Armed with this new knowledge, Odysseus set sail, hoping against all reason that he would find a way to avert disaster. The Sirens. They had only been sailing for half a day when Odysseus and his men began to hear a beautiful melody, each note so perfect it made them forget the world around. Odysseus knew at once what they faced. Every sailor had heard tales of the Sirens, creatures who lured men to their deaths with their bewitching songs, their island surrounded by the bones of those who had steered helplessly toward the sound. However, Odysseus had come prepared, thanks to Circe's warning. He ordered his crew to plug their ears with beeswax so they could not be seduced by the siren's call. But Odysseus himself refused to do so. Driven by curiosity, he wanted to be the first man to hear the siren's song and live to tell of it, ordering his men to bind him to the mast instead. As they passed the siren's island, Odysseus began to struggle. The siren sang of his deepest desires, of hidden knowledge only the gods knew. He fought against the ropes until they cut into his skin, screaming at his men to release him. But they could hear nothing, and only added more rope when he begged. When the island finally fell behind them, and Odysseus stopped struggling, they untied him. He collapsed to the deck, shaking and bleeding from the ropes, but alive. He was the first mortal to hear the siren's song and survive, and he would be the last. For an ancient prophecy decreed that if any mortal resisted their call, the sirens must die. And so, as his ship disappeared past the horizon, they threw themselves into the sea, joining the bodies of their countless victims. The curse fulfilled. Any hopes that the curse had been averted were dashed the very next morning, when Odysseus faced the most terrible choice of the journey so far. The sea narrowed into a strait between two cliffs that Circe had warned him of. On the left was Charybdis, a monstrous whirlpool that dragged whole ships to the depths. And on the right was Scylla, a six-headed creature that snatched sailors from passing ships, one for each head, and devoured them alive as their shipmates watched in horror. There was no path between them. Charybdis would destroy them all, while Scylla would take 6 men, no more, no less. 6 deaths to buy passage for the rest. Odysseus made his decision. He steered towards Scylla's cliff, ordering them to row and watch the whirlpool closely. While every eye was fixed on Charybdis, 6 heads shot down from the cave above, each snatching a man from his bench. The victims screamed Odysseus's name as they were lifted into the air, their arms reaching toward him even as the heads retracted into the darkness. But there was no time to grieve. As they left the strait, a great storm cloud gathered above them. Thunder rumbled and rain lashed down on the deck. Massive waves soared above them, crashing down with such force that the ship almost fell apart. With no other choice, they came ashore on the island of Thrinacia, where the cattle of the sun god grazed. Odysseus knew this place immediately. He had been warned that to touch the cattle meant death, making every man swear an oath to do them no harm. For a time the men obeyed, living on the provisions Circe had given them, but the storm raged on, trapping them on the island for a week, then 2 weeks, then a month. Their supplies ran out, and the men grew skeletal, chewing leather and boiling grass to survive. When Odysseus went inland to pray, the starving crew made their choice. Better to die quickly at the hands of the gods than waste away to nothing. They slaughtered the finest cattle and roasted the meat. When Odysseus returned and saw the smoke, he fell to his knees. "You fools! You have killed us all!" But the crew was beyond caring. They feasted for 6 days, and on the 7th, when the storm finally broke, they set sail. They had barely cleared the island when Zeus struck their ship with a thunderbolt, splitting it from stem to stern. The men were flung into the sea, and the waves took them one by one, pulling them under. Every man who had survived, Troy, the Cyclops, Circe, and Scylla, all of them drowned in minutes. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to the broken mast. For 9 days he drifted without food or water. On the 10th, the current carried him to the island of the nymph Calypso, who found him on her shore, more dead than alive. Calypso. Calypso fell in love with the clever mortal she rescued from the shore, offering Odysseus the gift of immortality if he agreed to stay with her forever. But Odysseus wanted only to reach home, to see his wife and son again after so many years away. 7 years passed on that island. Every day Calypso would ask him to stay without success, and every night he would spend crying on the shore, staring across the water toward a home he could not reach. It would take the intervention of the gods themselves to finally set Odysseus free. Athena, who had watched over Odysseus since Troy and prized him as her favorite mortal, could not stand to see his suffering continue any longer. She persuaded Zeus to order his release, leaving Calypso with no choice but to agree. Reluctantly, she helped Odysseus build a raft and sent him out to sea, but fate was still not finished with the man who had conquered Troy. As he sailed through Poseidon's domain, the god of the sea sent one final storm to shatter his raft, a final punishment for blinding his son. Odysseus was thrown into the churning waters, barely surviving as wave after wave crashed down on him. He washed ashore on a foreign island, shivering and exhausted, but for once fortune was truly on his side. The people there, the Phaeacians took pity on the broken traveller and listened to his story. He told them everything, from Troy to this very moment, every monster, every loss, every impossible choice. When he was finished, they were so moved by his story that they loaded a ship with gifts and a crew to carry him home. 20 years after he had left, Odysseus was finally sailing toward Ithaca. The suitors. The joy Odysseus felt when setting foot on Ithaca was unlike anything he had experienced before. Finally he was home. Finally he could see his wife and son. But things were not as he left them. Athena appeared beside him, determined to help her favourite mortal one last time. "Your house is full of enemies," the goddess told him. "Over 100 suitors have invaded your halls, eating your cattle, drinking your wine, and pressing Penelope to choose one of them as her new husband. You will need cunning if you are to survive." She touched him with her wand, and Odysseus felt his body wither and age, his skin sagging, his hair falling away, until he looked like an old beggar, unremarkable in every way. "This disguise will protect you," Athena told him. "Go now to your loyal swineherd, Eumaeus. Stay with him while I bring your son Telemachus to you." Odysseus went to visit the old swineherd as instructed, dining and sharing stories with Eumaeus, although he was careful to keep up his disguise, lest the information get back to the suitors. Finally, after 3 days, his son Telemachus appeared at the door. He had grown into a fine young man, kind and strong, with the sight of him filling Odysseus's heart with pride. When the swineherd left to tend his animals, Athena lifted the disguise, and Odysseus stood before his son as himself for the first time in 20 years. Telemachus threw himself into his arms, and they wept together, 20 years of separation pouring out in those precious moments. When they could speak again, they began to plan. Telemachus would return to the palace and quietly remove all weapons from the great hall. Odysseus would follow as a beggar, observing his enemies until the moment came to strike. The next day, Odysseus entered his own palace as a stranger, and what he found made his blood boil. Over 100 men lounged on his furniture, throwing bones at each other, wine staining the floors where he had once ruled. Worse still was their cruelty. When they saw Odysseus enter the hall disguised as an old beggar, they mocked and abused him. One man hurled a footstool at his back, while another forced him to fight another beggar for scraps. Odysseus endured the humiliation, memorizing every face for what was to come. He would not have to wait long, for that very evening Penelope would declare a contest to choose her new husband. "My husband's great bow hangs in the storeroom," she announced, "a weapon only he could string. Whoever strings it and shoots an arrow through 12 axe handles will become my husband. I cannot wait any longer." The next morning, the suitors gathered in the great hall. One by one they tried to string the bow. One by one they failed. They warmed it by the fire, rubbed it with fat, strained until their faces turned red and veins bulged in their necks. But the bow remained unbent, as if waiting for its true master. When every suitor had failed, the old beggar asked for a turn. The hall erupted in laughter, men hurling insults at him once again. But Penelope was not laughing. She insisted that the beggar, as her honoured guest, be allowed to try, despite his low station. With that, Odysseus found himself holding his bow for the first time in 20 years. He turned it slowly, examining every inch. The suitors laughed, mocking him for handling it like a merchant appraising goods. Then, as easily as a musician strings a lyre, Odysseus bent the great bow and slipped the string into its notch. The laughter died. He plucked the string, and it sang clear and sharp. Still seated, he fitted an arrow, drew and released. It flew through all 12 axe rings and buried itself in the far wall. "The feast ends," Odysseus said, rising to his feet. "Time now for a different sport." The next arrow took the leading suitor, Antinous, through the throat, lifting the man off the ground with the force of the blow. The suitors leapt up, searching the walls for weapons, finding only empty pegs. Telemachus had done his work well. Odysseus stripped away his rags. "Dogs! You thought I would never return. You consumed my wealth, abused my servants, and courted my wife while I still lived. Today you learn the price." What followed was a slaughter. Odysseus and Telemachus, joined by the loyal Eumaeus, moved through the hall without mercy. With Athena guiding their strikes, they cut down every man who had dishonoured Ithaca's king in his long absence, restoring order to the ancient palace. When it was over, there was only one thing left for Odysseus to do: reunite with his wife. Penelope was brought down from her chamber, but even seeing Odysseus restored to his true form, she held back. 20 years of false hopes had taught her caution. "If this is truly Odysseus," Penelope said carefully, "he and I will know each other. We have signs between us that no one else knows." Odysseus smiled. The wife of the most cunning Greek king was no fool herself. For once, he would be the one to face a test of wits. "Euryclea," she said to her old nurse, "move his great bed out of our bedchamber. Set it up for him elsewhere." "Move our bed?" Odysseus cried. "That bed cannot be moved. I built it myself around a living olive tree, shaped the trunk into the bedpost while it still grew from the earth. Tell me, Penelope, has someone destroyed it? Has someone defiled our chamber?" Penelope's face transformed. Only the true Odysseus could know that secret. She ran to him and threw her arms around his neck. They held each other, crying, 20 years of loneliness and stubborn hope pouring forth as they clung together. That night, in their bed built around the olive tree, the bed that could never be moved, Odysseus and Penelope found each other again, and the rest of the world fell away. The war was over. The wandering had ended. The king of Ithaca was finally home. I've been David Rintoul for Deep Dive History. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. Goodbye.